Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I heard them fall, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old timber groaning under 40 years of New England winters, pipes expanding in the basement, maybe a mouse knocking something over. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like someone carefully placing each plastic brick on the concrete floor, one by one, in a pattern I couldn't understand. I'd moved into Marcus's place 3 weeks after the divorce papers were signed. My brother-in-law offered his basement workshop while I got back on my feet, a generous gesture that came with strings I pretended not to see. The house felt hollow without Sarah's presence, though she'd never actually lived here. Still, her absence followed me like a shadow, settling into the corners of rooms I'd never shared with her. The workshop occupied the entire rear section of the basement, separated from the main area by a heavy wooden door that had warped over the years. Marcus told me he used to tinker down there, building model airplanes and fixing electronics, but he'd abandoned it some time back. Personal reasons, he'd said, and something in his voice made me drop the subject. The first week, I used the space purely for storage. Boxes of my former life stacked against the walls, tools I'd accumulated during 15 years of marriage arranged on pegboards that Marcus had left behind. The shelves were mostly empty except for a few forgotten jars of screws and bolts, and in the far corner, scattered across one entire shelf, hundreds of colorful Lego pieces. They looked recently played with, not covered in the dust that blanketed everything else. I asked Marcus about them when he stopped by to check on me. He'd gone pale, muttering something about needing to clean those out, but he never did. They remained there, bright primary colors that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights I'd installed. The noises started on a Tuesday evening. I'd been arranging my router and circular saw on the workbench when I heard the first piece hit the floor behind me. A sharp plastic tap against concrete. When I turned, a red Lego brick sat near my feet, though I was certain none had been there moments before. I picked it up, examining the small plastic rectangle. It was warm, as if someone had been holding it. My throat tightened as I looked up at the shelf. The Lego collection appeared undisturbed, still scattered in its chaotic array. I placed the brick back among the others and tried to return to my work, but my hands trembled as I adjusted the router's position. That night, lying on the pull-out couch upstairs, I kept thinking about that warmth. The basement was cold, perpetually damp despite the dehumidifier Marcus had installed. Nothing down there should have felt warm to the touch. The incidents multiplied over the following days. Always when I was working alone, always when my back was turned. I'd hear that distinctive sound, plastic hitting concrete, and turn to find another piece on the floor. Sometimes one, sometimes 3 or 4. Never the same colors, never in the same spot, and always warm. I started paying closer attention to the shelf itself. The Lego pieces weren't random. They formed distinct groupings, as if someone had been in the middle of building something and had simply walked away. There were partial structures, walls of a house, the beginning of a car, what looked like the foundation of a castle. Each time I visited the workshop, the configurations had changed slightly. Pieces moved or added in ways that seemed purposeful. My sleep grew fitful. Every creak of the old house made me wonder if someone was moving around downstairs. I'd installed new locks when I moved in, checked every window, but the feeling of intrusion persisted. During the day, when sunlight filtered through the basement windows, the workshop felt normal enough. But as evening approached and shadows lengthened, the air itself seemed to thicken. The first time I felt the breath on my neck, I was bent over the workbench, adjusting a clamp on a piece of wood I was trying to repair. The sensation was unmistakable. Warm air moving against my skin, carrying the faint scent of something sweet, like fruit punch or candy. I spun around so fast I knocked over my coffee mug, sending dark liquid cascading across the concrete floor. The workshop was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh white glow across every corner. But 3 Lego pieces lay scattered near my feet, still warm when I picked them up. I called Marcus that night, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked about the previous tenant. He'd been evasive, saying the house had been empty for over a year before I moved in. When I pressed about the Lego collection, he'd changed the subject entirely. There was something he wasn't telling me, something that made his voice crack when I mentioned the workshop. Sleep became impossible. I'd doze off around midnight, only to wake at 3 or 4 in the morning with the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone in the house. The feeling was so strong it made my chest tight, my breathing shallow. I'd lie there listening to the sounds of the old building, trying to distinguish between normal settling and something else entirely. One night, I gave in to the paranoia and crept downstairs. The basement was dark, except for the green glow of the dehumidifier's LED display. I pressed my ear to the workshop door and held my breath. Silence. But when I opened the door and flicked on the lights, I found something that made my blood freeze. The Lego pieces had been arranged into a perfect circle on the workbench, not scattered or random but deliberately placed, each brick touching the next in an unbroken ring about 2 feet in diameter. In the center sat a single yellow piece, a tiny Lego figure, facing the door as if it had been watching and waiting. My hands shook as I backed away from the workbench. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting moving shadows that seemed to dance around the edges of my vision. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I swept the pieces back onto their shelf with one violent motion, not caring how they landed. The yellow figure tumbled to the floor and I crushed it under my heel, hearing the plastic crack and splinter. But when I lifted my foot, the figure was intact, unmarked, staring up at me with its painted dot eyes. The incidents escalated. Tools would be moved overnight, rearranged in patterns I didn't recognize. My router would be unplugged and repositioned. Clamps would be left open in perfect circles on the workbench. And always, the sound of Lego pieces falling whenever I had my back turned. I started working only during daylight hours, avoiding the basement entirely after sunset. But even then, I could feel something watching me from the corners of the room. My peripheral vision would catch movement that wasn't there when I turned to look. The sensation of warm breath on my neck became constant, sometimes accompanied by what sounded almost like whispering, too faint to understand, but persistent enough to make my skin crawl. Marcus visited less frequently. When he did come by, he avoided looking directly at me, his eyes darting toward the basement door as if he expected something to emerge from it. I tried bringing up the strange occurrences, but he'd cut me off with increasing agitation, insisting I was working too hard, spending too much time alone. The truth came accidentally, during a conversation with Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who'd lived next door for 30 years. She mentioned how quiet it was since Marcus's family had moved out, how she missed hearing the sounds of life from the house. When I asked what she meant, her face clouded with confusion. She'd assumed I knew about Marcus's son, about what had happened in that basement workshop. The boy had spent hours down there, she said, building elaborate Lego cities and playing with model trains. Such a creative child, always making something new. The accident had been sudden, a seizure, she thought, though no one had ever given her the full details. Marcus had found his son collapsed in the workshop, and despite the paramedics' efforts, the boy had never regained consciousness. He'd lingered in a coma for 3 months before his parents made the decision to let him go. Mrs. Patterson's words hit me like a physical blow. The workshop hadn't been abandoned by choice. Marcus couldn't bear to enter it after losing his son. The Lego pieces, the warmth, the sensation of being watched, all of it took on a new, terrible significance. That night, I forced myself to return to the workshop. The fluorescent lights flickered as I descended the basement stairs, and the air felt heavier than usual, charged with an energy I could almost taste. The Lego shelf looked exactly as I'd left it, pieces scattered in their chaotic array. I sat on the floor in front of the shelf and spoke aloud to the empty room. I told the silence about Mrs. Patterson's revelation, about my understanding of what this space had meant to someone. I explained that I wasn't trying to replace anyone or claim something that wasn't mine. As I spoke, the air seemed to shift around me. The oppressive feeling that had plagued me for weeks began to ease, replaced by something gentler but no less profound. When I finished talking, I carefully rearranged some of the Lego pieces into a simple house: 4 walls, a door, a slanted roof. It wasn't elaborate, but it was purposeful. I left the workshop and didn't return for 3 days. When I finally did, the house I'd built had been expanded. New rooms had been added, a garden created from green pieces, tiny Lego trees arranged in neat rows. The work was intricate, impossible to achieve by accident or random falling. But the sensation of being watched was gone. The warm breath on my neck had ceased. The workshop felt peaceful for the first time since I'd moved in, as if some understanding had been reached. I never saw Marcus's son, never experienced anything I could definitively call supernatural. But every few days I'd return to find the Lego creation had grown or changed, always in ways that showed careful planning and imagination. I began leaving my own small additions: a car in the driveway, a swing set in the yard, tiny details that seemed to be appreciated and built upon. The workshop became a collaboration between the living and something else, something that needed to create and play and be remembered. I learned to work quietly, respectfully, understanding that I was sharing the space with someone who had claimed to it long before I arrived. When I finally moved out 6 months later, having found my own place and begun to rebuild my life, I left the Lego city intact. I told Marcus about it gently, explaining what I'd learned from Mrs. Patterson and how the workshop had become a place of peace rather than pain. He wept when he saw the elaborate construction his son's memory had helped create. The city covered most of the workbench now, a complex maze of buildings and streets and tiny gardens that spoke of hours of patient, loving work. Marcus decided to preserve it exactly as it was. He told me later that he'd started adding his own pieces sometimes, small tributes to the boy who'd once filled that basement with laughter and the sound of creativity. The workshop was no longer a place to avoid, but a space where love continued to build, one small piece at a time. I still dream about those warm plastic bricks sometimes, about the sensation of invisible hands carefully placing each piece in its perfect position. There's no fear in those dreams anymore, only the quiet satisfaction of work shared across impossible boundaries, of creation that transcends the simple limits of life and death. Story 2. The soot marks appeared every morning like accusations written in ash, each footprint perfectly formed yet belonging to no one I could see. They traced the same path from the bottom of the external staircase to the broken railing of the observation deck, where they simply vanished into the mountain air. I discovered them on my 3rd day at the Victorian cottage, the morning after I'd heard the first footsteps. The inheritance had come as a surprise, a distant uncle I'd never met leaving me his mountain retreat along with enough money to restore it. The cottage perched on a rocky outcrop 2 hours outside Denver, its gingerbread trim and wraparound porches desperately needing attention after decades of neglect. The external staircase that climbed to the observation deck had become treacherous, its railing broken in several places, planks warped and splitting. I'd planned to tackle the stairs first, but that initial night changed everything. The sounds began around midnight, deliberate footfalls on wooden planks, each step measured and purposeful. My pulse quickened as I lay in the downstairs bedroom, listening to someone climbing the external staircase. The footsteps paused at regular intervals, as if the climber was examining something, before resuming their ascent. My throat constricted. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles down the mountain. Cell service was spotty at best. I reached for the baseball bat I'd placed beside the bed and crept to the window. Moonlight illuminated the entire staircase, every weathered plank and broken rail visible in the pale glow. The structure stood empty, yet the footsteps continued, accompanied now by the groaning of stressed wood. I watched the planks flex and sag under invisible weight, shadows shifting as something climbed toward the observation deck. My hands trembled as I gripped the bat tighter. Cold sweat gathered at the base of my neck despite the October chill. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. Wind, settling wood, animals. But animals didn't climb stairs with such deliberate rhythm. and wind didn't make planks bend under phantom weight. The footsteps reached the top and stopped. I pressed my face against the glass, breath fogging the window as I strained to see. The observation deck remained empty, but I felt watched. Something was up there, studying the cottage below, studying me. My heart hammered against my ribs as minutes crawled by in silence. Then came the sound I'd remember forever, a long, agonized creak as the broken railing gave way further. In the morning, I found the soot footprints. They began at the base of the external stairs, perfect impressions in black ash that hadn't been there the evening before. Each print showed the outline of a work boot, size 10 or 11, with distinctive wear patterns on the heel and toe. They climbed the entire staircase, pausing at the same spots where I'd heard the footsteps hesitate. At the top, the prints approached the broken section of railing. The final footprint stood inches from the gap. Its toe pointed toward empty air, and a 60-foot drop to jagged rocks below. I examined every print carefully, my pulse racing again as I realized their impossible nature. The soot was real. I could smudge it with my finger, but no chimney or fireplace in the cottage had been used in years. The main house showed no signs of intrusion. No ash residue marked any other surfaces. The prints existed in isolation, as if someone made of soot itself had climbed these stairs. I spent that day reinforcing the railings and replacing the worst planks, telling myself the physical work would provide rational comfort. But as darkness approached, dread settled in my stomach like a stone. My mouth went dry thinking about midnight approaching. Would the footsteps return? Would I find fresh prints in the morning? They came again, precisely at midnight. This time, I was ready. I positioned myself at the kitchen window with a clear view of the stairs, a flashlight in one hand and my phone recording in the other. The night air carried the scent of pine and coming snow, but underneath lurked something else, the acrid smell of burned wood. The footsteps began their ascent. Through the window, I watched the stairs respond to invisible weight. Each plank compressed and rebounded as the presence climbed. My breathing became shallow as I focused the flashlight beam on the moving stairs, but the light revealed nothing. The footsteps paused at the 7th step, exactly where they'd hesitated the night before. A low whistling sound drifted through the darkness, not wind through the trees, but something deliberate and mournful. My skin crawled as the melody became recognizable, a funeral dirge I'd heard at my grandfather's service years ago. The footsteps resumed, accompanied by that haunting whistle. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone. The recording showed only empty stairs moving under invisible pressure, but the audio captured everything. Footfalls, creaking wood, that damned whistling that made my teeth ache. At the top, the presence moved toward the railing. I held my breath as the whistling stopped. Silence stretched for endless seconds before I heard the creak of stressed metal. Through my phone's camera, I watched the railing bend outward as if someone was leaning against it, testing its strength. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice, a sharp crack followed by a rushing whoosh, as if something heavy had plummeted through the air. I sprinted outside, flashlight beams sweeping frantically across the rocks below. Nothing. No body, no debris, no sign that anything had fallen. Just wind whispering through the pines and my own ragged breathing echoing off the mountainside. In the morning, fresh soot prints waited for me. This time, they told a different story. The prints climbed the stairs as before, but at the top, they approached the exact spot where the railing had bent. The final footprint stood at the very edge of the gap, but now additional marks scarred the deck. Long scrapes in the soot as if fingers had clawed desperately at the wooden planks. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was seeing. Someone had fallen. Someone was falling every night, over and over, trapped in an endless loop of death. But no one was dying. No body ever hit the rocks below. I researched the cottage's history that afternoon, driving down the mountain to find internet service at a coffee shop in the nearest town. The barista, a local woman with premature gray streaking her hair, grew quiet when I mentioned the property. She told me about Thomas Brennan, the cottage's original owner and builder. a railroad foreman who'd constructed the elaborate staircase and observation deck to watch trains threading through the valley below. One October night in 1897, neighbors reported seeing a light moving on his deck before hearing a terrible crash. They found his body on the rocks the next morning, along with evidence that the deck railing had failed. The barista's voice dropped to a whisper as she mentioned the discovery that had shaken the community. Soot marks throughout Brennan's cottage, as if he'd been walking through the house after climbing down from his chimney. Local folklore claimed he'd been trying to repair something when he fell, covered in ash from cleaning the flue. Since then, every October, hikers reported seeing lights on the observation deck and hearing footsteps on the external stairs. Most dismissed it as atmospheric pressure or animal activity. The few who investigated more closely told stories about soot footprints that appeared overnight, always ending at the broken railing. I drove back up the mountain with my stomach churning. The pieces fit too perfectly. The timing, the footprints, even the whistling that must have been Brennan's habit while working. But knowing the source of the haunting didn't diminish my terror. If anything, it intensified. That night I considered leaving. Packing my tools and heading back to Denver seemed like the rational choice. But something held me to the cottage. Maybe stubbornness, maybe curiosity, maybe some deeper connection to the tragedy that played out nightly on those stairs. I waited for midnight with growing dread. The footsteps came as expected, but this time they were different. Heavier, more urgent. The whistling began immediately, no longer mournful but frantic, almost panicked. Through the window I watched the stairs respond to aggressive movement, someone taking the steps two at a time, rushing toward some desperate goal. My heart rate spiked as understanding dawned. This wasn't just a replay of Brennan's death. This was his final night, the moment when everything went wrong. The presence reached the deck and moved directly to the railing. I watched the metal bend farther than ever before, groaning under strain. The whistling became a wordless cry of alarm as Brennan realized the railing was failing. The crack, when it came, was sharp as a gunshot. But this time, instead of the rushing sound of something falling, I heard scratching, scraping, the desperate scrabble of fingers trying to find purchase on smooth wood. Through the window, I could see the deck planks flexing as invisible hands fought to maintain a grip. The struggle lasted forever and an instant, then silence. In the morning, the sootprints told the complete story. They climbed the stairs in measured steps, approached the railing, then showed the chaos of the fall, multiple prints overlapping as Brennan had fought for balance, deep gouges where his boots had skidded, claw marks where his fingers had scraped against the wood. But one detail chilled me more than all the rest. At the very edge of the deck in the soot were the clear impressions of two hands pressed flat against the planks, as if someone had hauled themselves back up from the brink. The prints continued. They led away from the railing, across the deck, and down the stairs. But these footprints faced the wrong direction. They were walking backward, descending the stairs while facing upward, as if something was retreating while keeping watch on the deck above. The backward prints reached the bottom of the stairs and simply stopped. No trail led away from the cottage. No evidence showed where the presence had gone. I spent that day in a state of mounting anxiety, unable to concentrate on the renovation work. My hands shook when I tried to use tools. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. The smell of soot lingered in my nostrils despite the fresh mountain air. As evening approached, I made a decision that defied every rational instinct I possessed. I would wait on the observation deck. If Brennan was reliving his death nightly, perhaps seeing another person might break the cycle. Perhaps I could prevent the fall that had already happened over a century ago. I climbed the external stairs as sunset painted the mountains purple and gold. The deck felt solid under my feet, the new railing sturdy and secure. I positioned myself near the spot where the original railing had failed, close enough to help but far enough to avoid being pulled down if something went wrong. The weight stretched my nerves to breaking point. Every sound made me jump. Wind through the pines, settling timber, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The temperature dropped steadily as full darkness claimed the mountainside. At 5 minutes to midnight, the smell of soot thickened the air. I felt the presence before I heard it. A weight settled on the stairs below, making the entire structure vibrate slightly. My pulse hammered as the footsteps began, climbing toward me with familiar rhythm. But now I was part of the scene, standing where Brennan had stood, waiting where he had waited. The whistling began, that mournful dirge that raised goosebumps along my arms. Closer now, more distinct, I could hear the melody's sad beauty beneath its haunting tone. This wasn't the sound of madness or malevolence. This was loneliness given voice, decades of isolation expressed in a tune that spoke of loss and longing. The footsteps reached the deck. The presence moved past me, so close I felt the displacement of air. The scent of soot intensified, mixed now with other smells. Wood smoke, locomotive coal, the leather and sweat of honest labor. For just a moment, I glimpsed something from the corner of my eye. A tall figure in work clothes, suspenders and rolled shirt sleeves, moving with the careful gait of someone accustomed to dangerous heights. The figure approached the railing. I wanted to call out, to warn him, but my voice caught in my throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Yet the deck boards creaked under his weight as he leaned against the barrier that would soon fail. The railing groaned. This time, I heard more than structural stress. I heard a man's sharp intake of breath, the scrape of boots as he tried to step back, the desperate grab for stability that found only empty air. The metal gave way with a sound like breaking bones. But as the presence began to fall, as the whistling became a cry of terror, I lunged forward. My hands closed on nothing, empty air that felt somehow solid, somehow warm. I pulled back with all my strength, muscles straining against a weight I couldn't see. For an impossible moment, I held something at the edge of the deck. The presence hung in space, suspended between falling and safety. I felt fingers grip my wrists, calloused hands that hadn't touched anything solid for over a century. Then the weight was gone. The presence pulled itself back onto solid planks and stood beside me, breathing heavily though I heard no breath. The scent of soot began to fade, replaced by pine and mountain air. A whispered voice reached my ears, words so faint they might have been wind. "Thank you." The deck fell silent. The presence was gone, truly gone, in a way I felt rather than understood. The oppressive weight that had hung over the cottage for nights lifted like fog before sunrise. I remained on the deck until dawn, watching stars wheel overhead and listening to the peaceful sounds of a mountain night. No footsteps climbed the stairs. No soot would mark the planks come morning. When I finally descended, I knew I wouldn't find any prints. The cycle had broken. Thomas Brennan had found his rest. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I discovered one final mark in the dust. Not a footprint this time, but words traced in ash. The debt is paid. I finished the cottage renovation over the following weeks, working in blessed silence under autumn skies. The observation deck became my favorite spot to watch trains threading through the distant valley, just as Brennan had intended all those years ago. Sometimes, when the wind is right and the light falls just so across the mountains, I catch the faint echo of whistling, not mournful now, but content. A man's satisfaction with work well done, and a debt finally settled. The cottage stands peaceful on its rocky perch, no longer haunted by tragedy, but blessed with gratitude. And every evening, as sunset paints the peaks, I raise a silent toast to Thomas Brennan, a man who spent over a century learning that sometimes being saved is as simple as having someone there to catch you when you fall. Story 3. The house breathed around me in the darkness, its wooden bones creaking with secrets I wasn't meant to know. Traditional Japanese architecture carries weight differently than Western construction. Every joint, every beam bears the memory of centuries, and some memories refuse to rest. I'd inherited the property from my great-uncle Marcus, a man I'd met exactly twice before his passing. The lawyer had explained how Marcus had lived in Kyoto for 40 years, studying traditional crafts and slowly going native until he spoke more Japanese than English. The house came with everything inside: his books, his tools, his collection of antique shoji screens, and apparently, his dog. Yuki was a small white Akita mix, maybe 8 years old, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold conversations I couldn't quite hear. She'd taken to me immediately, perhaps sensing some familial resemblance, or perhaps simply grateful for human company after weeks alone with only the neighbors feeding her through the garden gate. The first night, I attributed her restlessness to grief. She paced the main room, her claws clicking against the tatami mats in an irregular rhythm that grated against my nerves. Every few minutes, she'd stop at the sliding doors that separated the main room from the smaller tea ceremony space, pressing her nose against the gap where the wooden frames met. Her whining started low, almost conversational, but gradually pitched higher until it became a keening that raised the hair on my arms. When I'd call her name, she'd look back at me with those dark eyes, then immediately return her attention to the doors. Something about her focus felt deliberate, purposeful, as if she were trying to communicate something specific about that particular space. The second night brought the same routine, but with an added element that made my mouth go dry. As Yuki positioned herself before the sliding doors, I noticed the rice paper panels beginning to dimple inward, as if someone on the other side were gently pressing against them. 5 distinct impressions appeared simultaneously, 4 fingertips and a thumb, clearly human in size and spacing. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the doors. The impressions held their shape for perhaps 10 seconds before the paper slowly returned to its normal flat surface. I slid the panels apart with trembling hands, revealing the empty tea room beyond. Moonlight filtered through the exterior shoji, casting everything in silver and shadow, but showing nothing that could explain what I'd witnessed. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying on the futon, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound the house made. Wood settling, wind through the garden, the distant hum of Kyoto's nighttime traffic. All of it seemed amplified, significant, threatening. My breathing grew shallow and my palms remained perpetually damp with nervous sweat. During the day, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Old houses shifted constantly. Changes in temperature and humidity could cause materials to expand and contract in strange ways. But these explanations felt hollow when night returned, and Yuki resumed her vigil at the doors. The third night, the impressions lasted longer. They appeared as soon as Yuki began her whining, pressing inward with enough force that I feared the delicate paper might tear. This time, I counted 6 separate sets of handprints, appearing in sequence as if someone were walking their palms along the surface from the inside. I yanked the doors open immediately, but again found nothing. The tea room sat empty, serene, mocking. Yet the air felt different, thicker, charged with a presence that made my skin crawl. I could taste copper in my mouth, and my hands shook as I slid the panels closed again. Research became my obsession. I spent hours online, reading about the house's history, about Japanese folklore concerning spirits and hauntings. The property records revealed that the building dated to the early 1800s, had changed hands multiple times, and had sat empty for several years before my great-uncle purchased it in the 1980s. Local folklore mentioned various types of spirits that might inhabit old buildings. Zashiki warashi, household spirits that were sometimes benevolent, sometimes mischievous. But the descriptions I found didn't match what I was experiencing. Those spirits were typically associated with children and family homes, not with the deliberate, almost methodical manifestations I witnessed nightly. The touching escalated gradually. By the end of the first week, the handprints appeared multiple times each night, sometimes accompanied by what looked like someone trailing their fingers down the paper's surface. The impressions grew deeper, more defined, and began appearing on multiple panels simultaneously. Yuki's behavior intensified correspondingly. She'd growl at the doors now, her hackles raised, body tense as if preparing to defend against an intruder, but her aggression felt confused, conflicted. Sometimes she'd bark aggressively, other times she'd whine pitifully, as if responding to something that was simultaneously threatening and familiar. My sleep deprivation compounded daily. Dark circles ringed my eyes and my hands developed a persistent tremor. Coffee lost its effectiveness, leaving me jittery but still exhausted. I started seeing movement in my peripheral vision during the day, shadows that shouldn't exist, shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly. The breakthrough came during my second week in the house. While organizing my great-uncle's papers, I discovered a leather journal tucked inside a wooden tea box. His handwriting filled page after page with observations about the house, about presences he'd sensed, about dreams that felt more real than waking life. According to his notes, Marcus had experienced similar phenomena, but had reached a different conclusion than I had. He didn't believe the house was haunted by a malevolent spirit. Instead, he theorized that the building itself existed in some kind of temporal overlap, where moments from its past occasionally bled through into the present. The handprints, he suggested, weren't supernatural attacks, but residual impressions from someone who had lived in the house decades or centuries earlier. Someone who had regularly moved through those same spaces, touched those same surfaces, lived a routine that occasionally echoed forward through time. This explanation should have brought comfort, but it didn't. If anything, it made the nightly visitations more unsettling. The idea that I was witnessing fragments of someone else's life, someone who had no idea they were being observed across the centuries, felt like a violation of something sacred and private. Marcus's final entries grew increasingly agitated. He wrote about feeling watched, about sensing someone moving through the house during the day when he knew he was alone. He described finding objects moved from where he'd left them, about waking to the sound of footsteps on the wooden floors. The last entry, dated just 3 months before his death, contained only a single line. "I think they know I can see them." That night, as if responding to my newfound knowledge, the manifestations changed. Instead of appearing on the tea room doors, the handprints began showing up throughout the house. I'd turn a corner and find fresh impressions on a window screen. I'd wake to discover them on the shoji panel beside my futon, close enough that whoever had made them must have been standing directly over my sleeping form. My paranoia reached fevered levels. I installed battery-powered cameras in every room, but they captured nothing. The impressions never appeared on the recordings, even when I could clearly see them with my naked eyes. This disconnect between what I witnessed and what technology recorded made me question my own sanity. Physical symptoms intensified. My appetite disappeared completely. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold chopsticks. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sound of movement in rooms I knew were empty. I'd lie motionless on the futon, listening to the soft whisper of feet on tatami, the quiet slide of shoji panels opening and closing. The climax arrived on my 13th night in the house. I'd fallen into an exhausted half-sleep when Yuki's barking jolted me awake. But this wasn't her usual whining or growling. This was pure terror, the kind of sound an animal makes when facing mortal danger. I stumbled toward the main room and stopped dead in the doorway. Every single shoji panel in the house showed handprints. Not just 1 or 2 impressions, but dozens, covering the rice paper surfaces from floor to ceiling. They appeared and disappeared in waves, as if multiple people were pressing against the screens from both sides simultaneously. Yuki cowered in the center of the room, spinning in circles, unable to decide which threat to face. The handprints moved with increasing urgency, some of them pushing so hard against the paper that I expected the panels to burst. And then, in the space of a single heartbeat, they all stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the manifestation itself. Every impression vanished at once, leaving the screen smooth and undisturbed. Yuki ceased her barking and sat down, panting heavily but no longer displaying signs of distress. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. On the shoji panel directly in front of me, at exactly eye level, a single handprint remained. But this one was different from all the others. This one faced outward, as if someone had pressed their palm against the paper from my side of the screen. As I stared at it, my own hand hanging at my side, I realized the print was the exact size and shape of my palm. The understanding hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't witnessing residual impressions from the past bleeding into the present. I was the residual impression. Somehow, my presence in the house was creating echoes that rippled backward through time, and I was seeing the effects of my own future haunting. Marcus's journal had been right about one thing. The spirits knew they were being watched. But he'd been wrong about who was doing the watching. I left the house the next morning, taking Yuki with me. The property remains empty, and I've made no effort to sell it or return. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Tokyo, I wonder if my great-uncle had made the same discovery before his death. I wonder if that's why he'd chosen to stay in the house despite the phenomena, not out of bravery or scientific curiosity, but because he'd realized that leaving wouldn't stop the haunting, because some stains once made can never be completely removed, and some impressions, once pressed into the fabric of time, echo forward and backward until they create their own reality. I still dream about those handprints. In my dreams, I'm standing in that tea room again, pressing my palms against the rice paper screens, trying desperately to communicate with someone on the other side. Someone who can see my touch but can't hear my voice, can't understand that I'm not trying to frighten them, I'm just trying to warn them. Story 4. Some hotels remember everything. The Warwick Arms, with its century-old bones and walls that had absorbed decades of whispered secrets, was one of them. What I thought would be a simple business trip to Hartford became something else entirely. Something that still makes my hands shake when I think about those 2 days in October. The building itself should have been warning enough. Built in 1924, it stood like a Gothic monument among the modern glass towers, its red brick facade weathered and stained with age. The lobby ceiling stretched impossibly high, decorated with peeling gold leaf that caught the amber light from ancient chandeliers. Everything creaked, the floorboards, the elevator cables, even the walls seemed to sigh with each gust of wind that rattled the windows. I checked in late Tuesday evening, exhausted from a delayed flight and wanting nothing more than to collapse into bed before my morning presentation. The desk clerk, a pale woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, handed me a brass key attached to a heavy wooden fob. Room 412, 4th floor. She mentioned something about the elevator being temperamental and suggested I use the stairs if I was in any hurry. The hallway on the 4th floor stretched longer than it should have, lined with burgundy carpet so worn that the pattern had faded to mere suggestions of its former design. Brass sconces cast weak yellow pools of light every few yards, leaving dark spaces between that seemed to shift and breathe in my peripheral vision. My footsteps were muffled, almost swallowed by the thick carpet, creating an unsettling silence that made me hyper-aware of every other sound. The building settling, pipes ticking in the walls, the distant hum of some mechanical system working somewhere deep in the hotel's bowels. Room 412 was at the far end of the hallway, tucked into a corner where 2 corridors met. The door was heavy wood, painted dark green sometime in the distant past, with the brass number hanging slightly crooked. The key turned with more resistance than it should have, and the lock made a grinding sound that sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine. Inside, the room felt immediately wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The furniture was antique, a massive wardrobe that dominated one wall, a writing desk positioned beneath a window that looked out onto the hotel's inner courtyard, and a bed with a headboard carved from dark wood that seemed to loom over the room. The wallpaper was a deep burgundy with gold patterns that created optical illusions in the dim light, making the walls seem to pulse slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. I hung my clothes for the next day in the wardrobe, a navy blue suit that I'd worn to countless business meetings, my lucky tie, a crisp white shirt. The wardrobe's interior smelled of old wood and something else, something sweet and cloying that I couldn't identify. Cedar, maybe, or some ancient potpourri. The hangers were old-fashioned metal ones, the kind that make a distinctive ringing sound when they knock against each other. Sleep came eventually, despite the unsettling atmosphere. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and the thick walls blocked most of the city noise. My last conscious thought was gratitude that I'd be leaving the next evening, returning to my familiar apartment and normal life. I woke to voices. 2 women were discussing my clothes with the casual cruelty that some people reserve for strangers they assume can't hear them. They criticized the fabric of my suit, questioned my choice of tie, wondered aloud about my taste in general. Their voices were clear and distinct, coming from somewhere very close, so close that for a moment, I thought they must be in my room. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay motionless, straining to locate the source of their conversation. The voices seemed to be coming from the direction of the wardrobe, though that made no logical sense. Hotel rooms didn't share closet space. The voices continued their assessment of my clothing choices, their tone becoming increasingly harsh and personal. One of them laughed, a sound like broken glass scraping against concrete. I forced myself to sit up, my mouth suddenly dry as cotton. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. in harsh red numbers. The room was dark except for the weak light filtering through the heavy curtains from the courtyard security lighting. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it, but something felt fundamentally different, as if the room's dimensions had shifted slightly while I slept. The voices had stopped. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the room's chill. I listened intently, but heard only the building's normal sounds. The heating system cycling on, the whisper of wind against the windows, the distant rumble of late-night traffic. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Business trips always disrupted my sleep patterns, and the stress of the presentation had me wound tight. But I knew I hadn't been dreaming. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay in bed, I swung my legs over the side and stood. The floor was ice cold against my bare feet, cold enough to make me gasp. I approached the wardrobe slowly, each step deliberate and careful. The brass handles gleamed dully in the dim light, and I could see my reflection distorted in their curved surfaces. My face pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear I was trying hard to suppress. I grasped the handles and pulled the doors open. The smell hit me first, that sweet, cloying odor I'd noticed earlier, but now much stronger and definitely not cedar. It was the smell of overripe fruit, of flowers left too long in stagnant water, of something organic beginning to decay. The scent was so intense it made my stomach lurch and my eyes water. My clothes were exactly where I'd hung them, but the hangers were moving, not swaying gently as if disturbed by the open doors, but actively swinging back and forth with enough force to make them clink against each other in a rhythmic, almost musical pattern. There was no air current in the wardrobe, no reason for the movement. The hangers moved as if invisible hands were pushing them, maintaining their momentum in defiance of physics. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The hangers continued their dance, and now I could see that it wasn't random movement. They were swinging in perfect synchronization, like pendulums keeping time to some unheard rhythm. The metallic ringing of their collisions created an eerie melody that seemed to fill the entire room. My hands trembled as I reached for the wardrobe doors, desperate to shut out the sight. But as I moved to close them, I heard the voices again. This time, they were definitely coming from inside the wardrobe, muffled as if speaking from a great distance or through thick fabric. They were no longer discussing my clothes. Now they were talking about me. One voice, higher and more nasal than the other, was describing my sleeping habits with disturbing accuracy, how I tossed and turned for the first hour, how I ground my teeth, how I talked in my sleep, things no one could know unless they'd been watching me all night. The second voice, deeper and more melodious, was providing commentary on my physical appearance that became increasingly invasive and inappropriate. She described the scar on my left shoulder from a childhood accident, the birthmark on my back that was hidden beneath my pajamas, details that made my skin crawl with the violation of privacy. I slammed the wardrobe doors shut with enough force to rattle the entire piece of furniture. The impact echoed through the room like a gunshot, but it didn't stop the voices. If anything, closing the doors seemed to amplify them. The two women continued their clinical dissection of my body and habits, their words becoming more degrading and personal with each passing moment. I backed away from the wardrobe until my legs hit the bed, then sat down heavily, my whole body shaking now. The voices were impossible to ignore, and they seemed to be getting louder, more insistent. They began speculating about my work, my relationships, my failures and insecurities, displaying knowledge they couldn't possibly have. The rational part of my mind searched desperately for explanations. Maybe the hotel's walls were thinner than they appeared, and I was somehow hearing a conversation from an adjacent room through acoustic tricks. Maybe the old building had interconnected spaces that weren't obvious from the room's layout. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations were true. I forced myself to stand and walk to the door, thinking I'd go to the lobby and demand a different room. But when I turned the handle, the door wouldn't budge. The lock wasn't engaged. I could see the brass deadbolt was retracted, but the door remained firmly closed as if something massive was pressed against it from the other side. Panic began to claw at the edges of my consciousness. I pulled harder on the handle, throwing my full weight against it, but the door remained immovable. The voices from the wardrobe grew louder, and now they were laughing again, that same sound like breaking glass that had first woken me. I turned to the window, thinking I might signal for help, but when I pulled back the heavy curtains, the view had changed. Instead of the hotel's inner courtyard, I was looking out at what appeared to be a vast, empty space filled with swirling gray mist. No buildings, no lights, no signs of the city that should have been visible beyond the hotel's walls. The unreality of it hit me like a physical blow. My knees nearly buckled, and I had to grip the window frame to keep from falling. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. Hotels didn't exist in empty voids, doors didn't seal themselves, and voices didn't emerge from empty wardrobes to recite personal information about sleeping strangers. But the evidence of my senses was undeniable. The voices in the wardrobe changed tone again, becoming urgent and insistent. They were calling my name now, using it over and over in ways that made it sound foreign and threatening. They seemed to know things about my past that I'd never told anyone. Childhood fears, embarrassing moments, private thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. One of them began describing the contents of my wallet in precise detail, down to the exact denominations of the bills I carried. The other started reciting my social security number, my mother's maiden name, the password I used for my online banking. Information that should have been impossible for anyone to know. I pressed my hands against my ears, but their voices seemed to come from inside my head now, bypassing my hearing entirely. They were in my thoughts, rummaging through my memories like burglars ransacking a house. I could feel them poking at my most private experiences, laughing at my fears and failures. The sensation was so violating, so fundamentally wrong, that I found myself screaming. The sound that came from my throat was raw and animalistic, born from a terror so deep it bypassed rational thought entirely. I screamed until my voice cracked and my throat burned, but even then, I could still hear them inside my head, commenting on the quality of my scream, rating my performance. Time became elastic. I might have been trapped in that room for minutes or hours. There was no way to tell. The clock on the nightstand had stopped working, its red display blank. The voices continued their relentless assault, describing increasingly intimate details about my life, my body, my thoughts. They spoke about things I'd forgotten myself, dragging up memories from childhood that I'd buried so deeply I wasn't sure they were real. Then suddenly they stopped. The silence was so complete it was almost painful. My ears rang in the absence of their voices, and for a moment I wondered if I'd gone deaf. I slowly lowered my hands from my ears, listening intently for any sound. The wardrobe doors were open again. I hadn't heard them open, hadn't seen them move, but they were definitely open. The interior was dark, darker than it should have been given the ambient light in the room. It was as if the space inside the wardrobe had become a void, a window into absolute nothingness. As I stared into that darkness, afraid to look away but equally afraid to keep watching, something began to take shape in the depths of the wardrobe. Two forms, indistinct at first, gradually becoming more defined. They were human-shaped but wrong somehow, their proportions slightly off, their movements too fluid and graceful to be entirely natural. They stepped forward into the light, and I saw their faces. They were beautiful in the way that poisonous things are beautiful, perfect features marred by something fundamentally predatory in their expressions. Their skin had a waxy quality that reminded me of old photographs, and their eyes reflected light like an animal's. They wore clothing from another era, elaborate dresses that rustled with movement despite the absence of any breeze. One of them smiled at me, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. The other tilted her head in a gesture that might have been charming in different circumstances, but now seemed calculating and cruel. They began to speak, but not with the voices I'd been hearing. These voices were different, older, more resonant, carrying undertones that seemed to vibrate in my bones. They spoke in unison, their words overlapping and interweaving in ways that made it difficult to understand their meaning. What I did understand was that they were extending an invitation. They wanted me to join them, to step into the wardrobe and leave this reality behind. They promised things, knowledge, experiences, freedoms that I couldn't imagine. They said I could leave my mundane life behind, abandon the pressures and disappointments that weighed me down. All I had to do was take a single step forward. The temptation was real and terrifying. Part of me wanted to accept their offer, to escape into whatever existence they represented. The rational world had never offered me much. A mediocre career, failed relationships, the grinding routine of modern life. What did I really have to lose? But something in their eyes stopped me. Beneath the beauty and the promises, I could see something else. A hunger that had nothing to do with offering me a better life. They didn't want to save me. They wanted to consume me, to add me to whatever collection of souls they'd already gathered. I took a step backward instead of forward. Their expressions changed instantly, beauty transforming into something ancient and malevolent. The temperature in the room plummeted, and frost began forming on the surfaces around me. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my teeth started chattering uncontrollably. They began to advance from the wardrobe, their movements now predatory and purposeful. The elegant dresses they wore began to shift and change, revealing glimpses of something underneath that I didn't want to see clearly. I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. To my surprise, it turned easily now, and the door swung open onto the hallway beyond. The corridor was exactly as I remembered it. Burgundy carpet, brass sconces, the long stretch of empty space leading to the elevator. I ran. My bare feet slapped against the worn carpet as I sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not footsteps exactly, but a sound like fabric tearing and wind howling through empty spaces. The brass sconces flickered as I passed them, and the shadows between them seemed to reach toward me with grasping tendrils. The elevator was at the far end of the hall, and I could see the brass call button gleaming in the dim light. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my lungs burning and my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I reached the elevator and stabbed the call button repeatedly, glancing back down the hallway. The two figures were gliding toward me with impossible speed, their forms becoming more distorted with each passing second. They no longer looked entirely human. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed obscenely normal given the circumstances. The doors opened to reveal the same brass interior I remembered from my arrival, complete with the mirror that reflected my panicked face back at me. I threw myself inside and hammered the lobby button, then the close door button, then every button I could reach. The doors began to slide shut with agonizing slowness, and I could see the two figures approaching rapidly. Just before the doors closed completely, one of them reached out toward me. Her fingers, now ending in what looked like sharp talons, brushed against the closing doors. The brass surface where she touched it began to tarnish and bubble, as if exposed to intense acid. The elevator descended with mechanical precision, and I collapsed against the back wall, sobbing with relief and residual terror. My whole body was shaking so violently I could barely stand, and my pajamas were soaked with sweat despite the cold. When the doors opened in the lobby, I stumbled out into the warm, well-lit space. The same desk clerk was there, reading a paperback novel under the amber chandelier light. She looked up at me with mild concern, taking in my disheveled appearance and obvious distress. I tried to explain what had happened, the words tumbling out in a confused rush. She listened patiently, nodding occasionally, her expression sympathetic but not particularly surprised. When I finished, she simply said that the fourth floor had always been problematic, and that she'd arrange for me to have a different room immediately. She handed me a new key, room 237 on the second floor, and assured me that I'd have no more trouble. Her matter-of-fact acceptance of my story was almost as unsettling as the events themselves, but I was too exhausted and traumatized to question it further. The new room was smaller and more modern, with plain walls and contemporary furniture. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting in a chair by the window, fully dressed and ready to flee at the first sign of anything unusual. But nothing happened. The sun rose normally, the city woke up around me, and the world returned to its familiar rational patterns. I checked out immediately after breakfast, cutting my business trip short and changing my flight to leave that same day. The desk clerk processed my early departure without comment, though I noticed she made a note in the computer that I was never to be assigned to the fourth floor again. On the flight home, I tried to convince myself that the whole experience had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Business trips, strange hotels, exhaustion, all perfectly logical explanations for a night of vivid nightmares. But 3 days later, I received a package at my home address with no return label. Inside was my lucky tie, neatly folded and smelling of that same sweet, cloying odor from the wardrobe. I'd left it hanging in room 412. Story 5. And the storm began at dusk, but it was the silence that warned me first. Not the howling wind or the rattling windows. Those came later. It was the complete absence of the city's usual electronic hum, that barely perceptible buzz of electricity flowing through walls and wires that you never notice until it stops. The refrigerator's compressor fell quiet. The heating unit's gentle whoosh ceased. Even the digital clocks went dark, their green numbers dissolving into black screens that reflected my own pale face back at me. I stood in the center of my loft, watching the blizzard rage beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Snowflakes struck the glass like angry moths, each impact leaving behind a wet smear that froze before sliding down. The storm had arrived faster than predicted, transforming the city into a white void. Streetlights below flickered once, twice, then died completely, swallowed by the advancing wall of snow. My breath formed small clouds in the rapidly cooling air. The building's backup generator should have kicked in by now, but the silence stretched on, broken only by the wind's increasingly violent assault on the windows. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained black. Dead. Everything electronic in the apartment had gone silent simultaneously, as if some invisible force had reached out and severed every connection to the modern world. That's when I noticed the smell. It started as something barely detectable, a waxy sweetness that seemed to drift from nowhere and everywhere at once. I turned in a slow circle, trying to identify the source, but the scent seemed to follow me, growing stronger with each breath. It reminded me of church candles, of funeral parlors, of childhood birthday parties where wishes went ungranted. The temperature dropped another degree, then another. My hands began to shake, though whether from cold or something else I couldn't tell. The darkness was complete now, pressing against me like a living thing. I stumbled toward the kitchen, muscle memory guiding me to the drawer where I kept emergency supplies. My fingers closed around a flashlight, and I pressed the button with desperate relief. Nothing. I shook it, pressed the button again, then tried the backup flashlight. Dead. The candles I kept for romantic dinners sat in their holders on the dining table, and I groped my way toward them, my shin connecting painfully with a chair leg. The lighter clicked once, twice, 3 times before finally producing a small flame. But as the wick caught fire, something was wrong. The flame wasn't the warm yellow-orange I expected. It flickered red, deep crimson, casting everything in the room in a hellish glow. I held the lighter closer to the candle, certain my eyes were playing tricks, but the flame burned red as fresh blood. Worse, as I watched, the wax began to change. What had been ordinary white wax moments before now gleamed scarlet, melting faster than it should, streaming down the candlestick in thick rivulets that pooled on the table like spilled wine. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stepped back, but the candle continued to burn, continued to bleed its red wax across my dining table. The sweet waxy smell grew stronger, cloying now, filling my nostrils until I could taste it on my tongue. I wanted to blow out the flame, but the alternative, returning to complete darkness, seemed worse. I moved to the living room, where several more candles sat on the mantelpiece. Maybe these would burn normally. Maybe whatever was happening to the dining room candle was just a fluke, some trick of the storm's electromagnetic pulse or my own stress-addled perception. I lit the first one with trembling fingers. Red flame, red wax. The second candle, the same. By the time I had lit the fourth, my breathing had become shallow and rapid. Each new flame cast more red light across the walls, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The wax flowed freely now, cascading from every surface like crimson waterfalls. It dripped from the mantelpiece, pooled on the hardwood floors, traced slow paths down the walls. I backed toward the center of the room, but the red light followed me, painted me, made my own skin look flushed and feverish. The smell was overwhelming now, sweet and sick, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I pressed my sleeve to my nose, but the fabric already reeked of that cloying scent. That's when I realized all the other lights had returned. Not electric lights. Those remained dead. But every lamp in the apartment now burned with candles that hadn't been there before. Table lamps, floor lamps, the chandelier overhead, all of them flickered with red flames, all of them wept red wax. The illumination was wrong, too bright and too dim simultaneously, creating stark shadows while leaving vast areas in impenetrable darkness. My mouth had gone completely dry. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt coated with dust. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Gas leak causing hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning, stress-induced psychosis. But my body knew better. Every instinct screamed danger, flooding my system with adrenaline that made my hands shake and my vision blur at the edges. I stumbled toward the windows, desperate for some connection to the outside world, some proof that reality still existed beyond these walls. But the storm had intensified, the snow falling so thick I couldn't see the building across the street. The wind howled now, a sound like voices screaming in unison, and something rattled against the glass. Not snowflakes, but something harder, more deliberate. The red wax had begun to spread across the floor toward me, flowing in streams that defied gravity, moving uphill, pooling around my feet. I stepped backward, but more wax flowed from behind, boxing me in. The temperature continued to drop, and my breath came in ragged puffs that looked black in the red light. I needed to leave. Now. I stumbled toward the door, my shoes sliding on the slick wax. The hallway beyond was dark, but anything was better than staying in this crimson nightmare. My hands fumbled with the deadbolt, slippery with nervous sweat, before finally turning the lock. The door swung open, and I burst into the hallway. The relief lasted exactly 3 seconds. The hallway candles burned red, too. Emergency lighting that should have been battery-powered flickered with those same impossible flames, casting the same sickening glow. Red wax ran down the walls like blood, pooled in the corners, dripped from the ceiling tiles. The smell followed me, stronger now, as if I had carried it with me in my clothes, my hair, my lungs. I ran for the stairwell, my footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. Behind me, I could hear something else, a soft dripping sound, like rain on leaves, but I knew it was the wax, following me, hunting me. The stairwell was marginally better, lit only by dim emergency lights that still functioned normally, but I could smell that sweet stench creeping down from the upper floors. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my legs burning with the effort. My breathing had become loud and harsh, echoing off the concrete walls. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold, and my heart felt like it might burst from the sustained terror and exertion. I reached the ground floor and burst through the exit door into the lobby. More red candles, more flowing wax. The lobby looked like the scene of a massacre, every surface coated in that crimson substance. It flowed from the reception desk, the potted plants, the decorative fixtures. The smell was so strong now that I gagged, pressing my hand to my mouth to keep from vomiting. I had to get outside, Had to escape this building that had become a temple to some red-lit nightmare. The main doors were heavy glass, and I threw my full weight against them. They opened with a groan, and I stumbled out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical blow, wind-driven snow stinging my face and hands. But it was clean cold, honest cold, without that sweet stench. I breathed deeply, letting the freezing air scour my lungs. Behind me, red light flickered through the lobby windows, but out here was only the natural darkness of the storm. I started walking, my shoes slipping on the snow-covered sidewalk. I needed to find other people, needed confirmation that the world hadn't gone insane, that this was some localized phenomenon affecting only my building. But as I walked, fighting against the wind, I began to notice something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Footprints in the snow behind me, not my own. Those I could see clearly, a trail of deep impressions leading back toward the building. These were different. They glowed with a soft phosphorescent light, clearly visible even in the storm. They matched my stride perfectly, following my exact path. But they weren't quite the right size. Too long, too narrow, with strange indentations that suggested something other than human feet. I stopped walking and turned around. The glowing prints continued right up to where I stood, then stopped. Nothing visible made them, no figure casting shadows in the storm, but they were there, real, undeniable. I started walking faster, my breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the cold. Behind me, new prints appeared with each step I took, matching my pace exactly. The snow fell harder, but the luminescent tracks remained clearly visible, as if whatever made them burned with its own inner light. My legs felt weak, rubbery. I broke into a stumbling run, desperate to reach the intersection ahead where streetlights might still function, where other people might have taken shelter. But the prints followed, always exactly one step behind, always glowing with that sick phosphorescence. I reached the middle of the intersection and stopped, spinning in a circle. The storm raged around me, snow stinging my eyes and filling my mouth. Behind me, the trail of glowing footprints stretched back toward my building, perfectly clear despite the blizzard. But as I watched, they began to fade, starting with the oldest ones near the building and working their way toward me. One by one, they dimmed and disappeared, swallowed by the falling snow. The trail shortened, coming closer, as if whatever had made them was being erased from existence step by step. I watched in fascination and terror as the prints vanished, working their way up the street toward where I stood. The last print disappeared just as it reached my feet. I stood alone in the intersection, surrounded by unmarked snow, with no trace of the glowing trail that had followed me. The storm continued to rage, but the oppressive sense of being hunted had lifted. I was just a man standing in a blizzard, cold and frightened, but alive. But as I turned to look back at my building, I saw red light flickering in every window, every apartment, every floor. The entire structure glowed like a massive candle, bleeding red wax into the storm. And in that crimson illumination, I could see other buildings beginning to flicker as well, one by one, as if whatever had claimed my loft was spreading outward into the city. I started walking again, away from the building, away from the red lights. My feet left normal prints in the snow now, dark impressions that filled quickly with fresh flakes. But with each step, I carried with me the knowledge that somewhere behind me, candles burned red and wax flowed like blood, and that whatever had followed me into the storm was still out there, patient and invisible, waiting for the next time darkness fell and the lights went out. The sweet smell of wax still clung to my clothes, and I knew it would never completely wash away. Story 6. Something was wrong with the photograph the moment I developed it, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The building's facade looked normal enough in the harsh afternoon sunlight, 12 stories of concrete and glass stretching toward a cloudless sky. But there was an undercurrent of wrongness that made my stomach clench as I studied the image under the red light of my darkroom. I had been documenting abandoned architecture for my portfolio, drawn to the stark beauty of the Meridian Tower that had stood empty for 3 years since the last tenant moved out. The building wasn't condemned, just forgotten, existing in that liminal space between past and future where shadows seemed to gather in corners they shouldn't. When I'd stood on the sidewalk that afternoon, adjusting my camera settings, nothing had seemed amiss. The windows reflected the sky and neighboring buildings in perfect symmetry, their mirrored surfaces catching the light like a checkerboard of silver squares. But in the photograph, something else looked back. My hands trembled as I held the print closer to the amber light. In nearly every window, barely visible against the reflected sky, stood the silhouette of a man. Each figure wore what appeared to be a fedora or similar hat, their postures unnaturally still, and from their shadowed faces came thin wisps that could only be cigar smoke. The smoke was so faint I had to squint to make it out, but it was there, dozens of ghostly tendrils curling against the glass from the inside. I set the photograph down and pressed my palms against my eyes until stars burst behind my lids. When I looked again, the figures remained. 37 of them, I counted. 37 men who had not been visible to my naked eye when I'd taken the shot. Men who cast no reflection of the camera's flash, yet somehow had been captured by the film itself. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Light refraction, double exposure, some quirk of the building's glass that created optical illusions. But even as I grasped for rational causes, a deeper certainty settled in my chest like cold water. I had photographed something that shouldn't exist. Sleep evaded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those motionless figures standing vigil behind their glass barriers. The uniformity of their posture disturbed me most, each man standing at precisely the same angle, as if they were all looking at the same thing. Looking down at the street, looking at where I had stood. The next morning brought no relief. Sunlight streaming through my apartment windows felt thin and inadequate, failing to burn away the chill that had settled in my bones. I tried to dismiss the whole incident as an overactive imagination, but when I passed a newsstand on my way to buy coffee, a headline caught my attention. Historic office buildings sold after 3 years vacant. The accompanying photograph showed the Meridian Tower. My coffee went cold as I read the article. The building had been purchased by a development company planning to convert it into luxury condominiums. The piece mentioned that the Meridian had been a thriving office complex until a series of unexplained incidents in the early 2020s had driven out the remaining tenants. The reporter had been unable to get specifics about these incidents, noting only that several businesses had broken their leases suddenly and simultaneously, leaving behind fully furnished offices. I found myself walking back to the Meridian Tower without conscious decision, my camera bag slung over my shoulder like a weight pulling me forward. The building looked different in the morning light, less imposing, more mundane. Traffic hummed past on the busy street, and a few pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk, none of them paying any attention to the empty structure looming above. I positioned myself at the exact spot where I'd stood the day before and raised my camera. Through the viewfinder, the building appeared normal. No figures in the windows, no mysterious shadows, just empty offices reflecting the city around them. But my finger hesitated over the shutter button. The memory of those watching silhouettes made my skin crawl, and I found myself scanning each window with growing dread. The photograph I developed 2 hours later was worse than the first. This time, the figures were clearer, more defined. I could make out details that hadn't been visible before. The cut of their suits, the angles of their hats, the way they held their cigars between gloved fingers. And they were closer to the windows now, pressed against the glass as if straining to get a better view of the street below. Of me. One figure, on the 7th floor, third window from the left, seemed to be pointing directly at the camera. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the print. The developing chemicals felt suddenly acrid in my nostrils, making me lightheaded. I stumbled out of the dark room and into my living room, but even there, surrounded by familiar furniture and the comforting chaos of my everyday life, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. That night, I researched the Meridian Tower's history, with the desperate thoroughness of a man trying to prove his own sanity. What I found made the fear in my chest coalesce into something solid and choking. The building had been constructed in 1952 by Meridian Development Corporation, a company owned by Theodore Blackwood, a local businessman with rumored ties to organized crime. The Meridian had served as headquarters for various Blackwood enterprises throughout the 1950s and 60s, including several businesses that were later investigated for racketeering, money laundering, and tax evasion. In 1967, Theodore Blackwood and 36 of his associates had disappeared simultaneously. Their cars were found in the Meridian's parking garage, engines still running, doors open, personal effects scattered on the seats. No bodies were ever discovered. No ransom demands were made. The men had simply vanished, leaving behind grieving families and a web of criminal enterprises that collapsed within months. 36 associates, plus Blackwood himself. 37 men. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, cross-referencing dates and names, following digital breadcrumbs through decades-old newspaper archives. Every detail confirmed what my rational mind refused to accept. The figures in my photographs matched the number of men who had disappeared from the Meridian Tower 58 years ago. Sleep was impossible. I paced my apartment until dawn, checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows, drawing curtains against the city lights beyond. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every creak of the building settling sent adrenaline surging through my system like poison. But it was the phone call that finally broke my resolve. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, gravelly with age and cigarette smoke. The caller simply said that I should stop taking pictures of things I didn't understand, then hung up before I could respond. The number showed as blocked when I tried to call back. I told myself it was a prank, a coincidence, someone who had seen me at the building and decided to have some fun with the obvious amateur photographer. But when I checked my caller ID history, I found something that made my blood turn to ice water. The call had lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, though I was certain it had been no more than 10 or 15 seconds of actual conversation. The gaps in my memory terrified me more than anything else. What had happened during those missing minutes? What had the voice told me that my mind had chosen to forget? That afternoon, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist, I returned to the Meridian Tower one final time. My camera felt heavier than it should, the metal cold against my palms despite the warm day. I positioned myself in the same spot, raised the viewfinder to my eye, and saw them. Not in the photograph, not developed later in chemicals and red light. I saw them standing in the windows with my naked eye, as clear as my own reflection in a mirror. 37 men in dark suits and fedoras, their faces obscured by shadow but their attention unmistakably focused on me. They stood perfectly still except for the slow, rhythmic movement of their hands as they drew on their cigars. The smoke they exhaled seemed to fog the windows from the inside, creating patterns that looked almost like writing, like messages I couldn't quite decipher. The man on the 7th floor, the one who had been pointing at my camera, was no longer pointing. Instead, he was beckoning. His gloved hand moved slowly, hypnotically, calling me forward. I took a step toward the building before I realized what I was doing. Then another. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but that voice seemed to come from very far away, muffled and indistinct. The figures in the windows grew clearer with each step I took, their faces emerging from shadow to reveal expressions of patient satisfaction. They had been waiting. All these years they had been waiting for someone who could see them, someone who could capture their images and prove their existence. They needed a witness. They needed someone to know that they were still there, still watching, still conducting whatever business had kept them anchored to this place long after their bodies had turned to dust. I was 10 feet from the building's entrance when my survival instincts finally overrode the strange compulsion pulling me forward. I stopped so suddenly that I staggered, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The figures in the windows hadn't moved, but their posture had changed subtly. Where before they had seemed patient, now there was an edge of hunger in their stillness. I backed away slowly, not daring to turn around until I had put a full city block between myself and the Meridian Tower. Even then I could feel their eyes following me, burning into my back like brands. I never developed that final roll of film. I took it straight from my camera to the furnace in my building's basement and watched it curl and blacken in the flames. But sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and shadows pool in corners they shouldn't, I wonder if destroying the photographs was enough. I wonder if they needed the images to maintain their presence in our world, or if the images needed them. Because lately I've been seeing figures in other windows, other buildings, other photographs I haven't taken yet. And I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in the Meridian Tower, 37 men in fedoras are still smoking their cigars and waiting patiently for me to come back and finish what I started. They know where I live now. They know my phone number. They know that I can see them. Most nights I keep my curtains drawn and my camera locked away in a closet I never open. But sometimes, when the urge becomes too strong to resist, I find myself walking through the city with my lens cap off and my shutter ready, because the terrible truth is that part of me wants to see them again. Part of me wants to know what they're really waiting for, and part of me is terrified that I'm about to find out. Story 7. The rental agreement should have been straightforward. A young couple with their adult daughter, quiet tenants for my downtown flat. But 3 weeks into their lease, I received the call that would unravel everything I thought I understood about the property I'd inherited from my grandmother's estate. The tremor in Margaret Henley's voice cut through the phone line like broken glass. She explained that her 25-year-old daughter Sarah hadn't slept properly since moving into my flat, claiming that something sat at the foot of her bed each night, applauding in slow, deliberate rhythm until sunrise. The family had discovered a porcelain doll missing from the basement storage area, an antique piece with glassy blue eyes and ringlet curls that I vaguely remembered from childhood visits to my grandmother's house. Margaret's description of the nightly disturbances sent ice water through my veins. The doll would appear sometime after midnight, perched at the edge of Sarah's mattress, its small porcelain hands coming together in methodical, whisper-soft applause. The sound would continue for hours, never stopping, never varying in tempo. Just that haunting pat, pat, pat echoing through the darkness until dawn broke and the figure vanished. I assured Margaret that I would investigate immediately, though my mouth had gone dry as cotton while she spoke. Something about her account triggered a deeply buried memory, a fragment from when I was perhaps 8 years old, visiting my grandmother during a particularly sweltering summer. I remembered being afraid to sleep in the guest room, telling my parents about sounds coming from the walls, about feeling watched. My grandmother had dismissed my fears as childhood imagination, but now, decades later, those half-remembered terrors clawed their way back to the surface. The next evening I drove across town to inspect the property. The building stood on a corner lot, its red brick facade weathered by decades of harsh winters. 3 stories tall with my flat occupying the entire second floor, it had been my grandmother's pride for 40 years before her death 6 months ago. I'd been renting it out ever since, trying to maintain some income from the property while deciding whether to sell. The Henleys met me at the entrance, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Margaret appeared older than her 50-something years, her graying hair pulled back severely, while her husband Robert's normally robust appearance had taken on a gaunt quality. Sarah emerged from the shadows of the hallway like a ghost herself, hollow-eyed, pale, with the jittery movements of someone running on caffeine in desperation. Robert explained that they'd searched every inch of the flat for the missing doll, but found no trace of it. The basement storage room where it had been displayed on a shelf now showed only a rectangular patch of clean wood surrounded by decades of dust. The doll had simply vanished, as if it had walked away on its own miniature legs. Sarah's hands shook as she described the nightly visitations. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as she recounted the way the doll would materialize in her peripheral vision, always sitting perfectly upright with its legs dangling over the edge of the bed. Its face would be turned toward her, those glassy blue eyes reflecting whatever light filtered through the curtains. The applause never wavered, not too fast, not too slow, but with the mechanical precision of a metronome counting down to something terrible. I descended into the basement with Robert, my flashlight beam cutting through air thick with the smell of old wood and mothballs. The The storage area occupied a corner of the foundation, shelves lined with my grandmother's collection of antiques and curiosities. The empty space where the doll had sat seemed to pulse with absence, as if the shadows themselves remembered what belonged there. Robert mentioned that they'd found the basement door unlocked on several occasions, despite his certainty that he'd secured it each night. The old iron key would be sitting on the kitchen counter in the morning, though none of them remembered leaving it there. Scratch marks scored the wooden door frame around the lock, fresh gouges in the aged wood that hadn't been there when they'd moved in. That night, I decided to remain in the building. I set up a chair in the hallway outside Sarah's bedroom, armed with a thermos of coffee and a sense of protective duty toward my tenants. The old building settled around me with its familiar symphony of creaks and groans, but nothing prepared me for what would unfold as the hours crawled toward midnight. The temperature dropped first, not gradually, but in a sudden plunge that left me pulling my jacket tighter and watching my breath mist in the air. The heating system continued to hum, but the warmth seemed to drain away as if something were actively consuming it. My skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the cold. Then came the footsteps. Tiny, deliberate impacts echoed from somewhere within the walls themselves. Not the scurrying of rodents, but the measured pace of something walking with purpose. The sounds moved through the building's frame like a ghost navigating passages that existed in dimensions parallel to our own. My heart began hammering against my ribs as I realized the footsteps were ascending, climbing from the basement toward the second floor. Sarah's bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see the foot of her bed illuminated by the streetlight filtering through her window. She lay motionless under her covers, either asleep or paralyzed with terror. The footsteps ceased somewhere inside the walls of her room, and for several minutes, only the sound of my own ragged breathing filled the hallway. The applause began at 12:47 a.m. Soft, rhythmic clapping drifted from Sarah's room like the ghostly echo of a performance that had ended decades ago. The sound possessed an almost musical quality, each tiny impact perfectly timed, never rushing, never slowing. My throat constricted as I leaned forward in my chair, straining to see through the crack in the door. A small silhouette sat perched on the edge of Sarah's mattress. The doll's profile was unmistakable. The elaborate curls, the ruffled dress, the impossibly straight posture. Even in the dim light, I could make out the gleam of its porcelain face turned toward the sleeping woman. Its hands moved with mechanical precision, coming together and apart in that endless, hypnotic rhythm. My legs trembled as I rose from the chair, every instinct screaming at me to flee the building immediately. But my tenants were trapped in there with that thing, and whatever connection it had to my grandmother's property made me responsible for their safety. I crept toward the bedroom door, my sweaty palm slipping on the brass handle as I eased it open another inch. The doll's head swiveled toward me with the smooth motion of a music box figurine. Those glassy blue eyes locked onto mine with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. Its painted smile seemed to widen as we stared at each other across the darkened room, and the applause never stopped. Pat, 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 marking time like a countdown to hell. The thing's gaze held mine with predatory focus, as if it were studying me, cataloging my fears for future use. I backed away from the door, my heart thundering so violently I feared it might burst. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, and shadows writhed at the edges of my vision like living things hungry for my sanity. The applause continued behind me as I stumbled toward the staircase, that relentless pat, pat, pat following me like an accusation. The basement door stood wide open. I'd watched Robert lock it before retiring for the evening, had heard the iron key turn in the mechanism myself. Now it gaped like a mouth, revealing only impenetrable darkness beyond. The smell of old earth and decay wafted up from the depths, carrying with it something else. The faint scent of roses and talcum powder, the perfume my grandmother had worn in her final years. Against every rational thought in my mind, I descended the stairs. The storage area had been transformed. Every antique and curiosity my grandmother had collected over decades now faced the empty shelf where the doll had once sat, arranged in perfect concentric circles like worshippers surrounding an altar. Jewelry boxes, vintage photographs, Ornate mirrors, china dolls, and dozens of other objects formed an intricate pattern that hurt my eyes to look at directly. In the center of this bizarre shrine, a single item that hadn't been there before, my grandmother's leather-bound journal, open to a page dated exactly 50 years ago. My hands shook as I lifted the book and read her careful script by flashlight. The entries described a young family who had rented the flat in 1975, a couple with their adult daughter who complained of nightly disturbances. The daughter claimed that a porcelain doll would appear in her room each night, sitting on her bed and clapping until dawn. My grandmother's notes grew increasingly frantic over several pages, documenting her own investigations and her growing certainty that something supernatural was attached to the doll. The final entry stopped my blood cold. I've made my choice. The doll serves a purpose beyond our understanding. It feeds on fear and sleeplessness, growing stronger with each passing night. But it can be satisfied, contained. I've arranged things so that it will only manifest every 50 years, when the right tenants present themselves. The cycle must continue, or else... The sentence ended there, ink scattered across the page as if she'd been interrupted. The applause had stopped. Silence pressed against my eardrums like water at depth, so complete that I could hear the blood rushing through my veins. I climbed the basement stairs on legs that barely supported my weight, my vision tunneling with each step. The hallway above stretched before me like a gauntlet, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was being watched from every shadow. Sarah's bedroom door now stood completely open. The bed was empty, covers thrown back as if she'd left in haste. No sign of the doll remained, but the impression of its small body was clearly visible in the mattress where it had sat. The room felt charged with residual energy, like the air after a lightning strike, and my skin crawled with the sensation of invisible eyes tracking my every movement. I found the Henley family in the kitchen, huddled together around the table with their suitcases packed and ready. Sarah's appearance had improved dramatically. The hollow look had vanished from her eyes, and color had returned to her cheeks. She explained that the doll had simply disappeared during the night, taking with it the crushing weight of exhaustion that had plagued her for weeks. They left within the hour, their relief palpable as they loaded their car and drove away into the pre-dawn darkness. I stood alone in the empty flat, understanding finally what my grandmother had done and what she'd passed on to me. The doll would return, but not for another 50 years. Not until the next family with just the right vulnerability moved in, providing it with the fear and sleeplessness it craved. I locked the basement door and pocketed the iron key, knowing that it would make no difference when the time came. The doll would find its way back to the bedroom, would resume its eternal vigil and its haunting applause. And I would be responsible for the next family that fell into its web, just as my grandmother had been responsible for the Henleys. The rental agreement for my flat would remain unsigned for the next 5 decades. Some cycles, I realized, are too dangerous to break, and too terrible to explain to anyone who might try to help. The porcelain watcher sleeps now, somewhere in the spaces between walls, counting down the years until it can dance again to the rhythm of human terror. And I remain its unwilling guardian, keeper of a secret that claps softly in my dreams, and will never let me rest completely easy. Not until someone else inherits this burden from me. Story 8. The scent of cheap cologne lingered in my hallway like a ghost refusing to pass on, thick and cloying against the autumn air that should have been crisp and clean. Something was wrong in my house. Something that made my German shepherd's hackles rise and his lips pull back in a silent snarl whenever he approached the basement door that I was certain I had locked that morning. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my front yard as I pulled into the driveway, my mind still foggy from another mind-numbing day at the office. The sight that greeted me snapped me into sharp focus immediately. Lucas, my neighbor from 3 houses down, was sprinting across my backyard with the desperate urgency of someone fleeing a crime scene. His lanky frame moved with surprising speed as he vaulted over my fence line, not bothering to use the gate that separated our properties. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sat in my car, engine still running, watching him disappear behind the hedgerow that bordered his property. Lucas had always been odd, the kind of man who watched too long from his windows and whose conversations felt like interrogations disguised as small talk. But this was different. This was violation. I killed the engine and stepped out into the cool air, my senses hyper-alert. The backyard appeared undisturbed from where I stood, but appearances meant nothing when dealing with someone who moved like a shadow through other people's lives. My hands shook slightly as I fumbled with my keys, the metallic jingling seeming unnaturally loud in the afternoon quiet. Inside, Rex greeted me with unusual agitation. The 100-pound dog, who typically bounded toward me with tail-wagging enthusiasm, now stood rigid in the hallway, his amber eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. His entire body vibrated with tension, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. The low rumble that emerged from his throat wasn't his normal warning bark. It was something primal, something that spoke to an ancient fear buried deep in both our DNA. Following his gaze, I found myself staring at the basement door, the door that I distinctly remembered locking before leaving for work. The door that now stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. My mouth went dry as dust, my tongue feeling thick and useless against my teeth. The logical part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Perhaps I had forgotten to lock it. Perhaps the latch was faulty. Perhaps Rex had somehow nudged it open during his afternoon wandering through the house. But logic felt thin and inadequate when confronted with the evidence of my senses and the unmistakable wrongness that seemed to emanate from that slice of shadow. I approached the door with Rex at my side, his breathing shallow and rapid. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, my legs heavy and uncooperative. The basement had always been my refuge, my workshop where I restored vintage furniture and lost myself in the meditative rhythm of sanding and staining. Now it felt like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The smell hit me before I reached the threshold. Cologne. Not the subtle, expensive kind that whispered of good taste, but the aggressive, drugstore variety that announced its presence like a neon sign. It was Lucas's scent. I recognized it from the few uncomfortable conversations we'd shared over the years. The realization sent ice water through my veins. Rex refused to cross the threshold, his paws seemingly glued to the hallway floor. His whimpering added a soundtrack of anxiety that made my already frayed nerves vibrate like guitar strings. I reached for the light switch with a trembling hand, half expecting something to grab me from the darkness below. The fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing my basement workshop exactly as I had left it. Tools hung in their designated places. Half-finished projects sat undisturbed on my workbench. Nothing appeared to have been touched, yet everything felt contaminated by the lingering presence of an unwelcome visitor. I descended the stairs on unsteady legs, my breathing sharp and shallow in my chest. Each creaking step echoed in the space like gunshots. The cologne smell grew stronger as I moved deeper into the basement, concentrated near my workbench where I kept my most valuable restoration tools. My hands were slick with sweat as I examined the area, looking for any sign of disturbance. That's when I found it, a single footprint in the thin layer of sawdust that had accumulated near my tool cabinet. A size 11 boot print that definitely wasn't mine. The pattern was clear and distinct, pressed into the dust with the weight of someone who had stood there for an extended period. Someone who had been examining my things with careful deliberation. My stomach lurched as I imagined Lucas standing in my space, breathing my air, touching my belongings with his pale, nervous fingers. The violation felt almost physical, like discovering someone had been sleeping in my bed or wearing my clothes. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a loose board, sending me crashing against my workbench with enough force to rattle the tools hanging above. The sound seemed to echo forever in the confined space, amplified by my fear into something monstrous and unnatural. Rex's barking from upstairs added to the cacophony, a distant alarm that only heightened my sense of isolation and vulnerability. I bolted up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, driven by a primal need to escape the contaminated space below. Rex met me at the top, his relief palpable as he pressed his warm body against my legs. Together we stood in my hallway, both of us staring at that damn door as if it might spring open on its own. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of paranoid vigilance. I checked every window lock twice, examined every entrance for signs of tampering, and called my security company to schedule an emergency system upgrade, but no amount of mechanical protection could address the deeper violation. The knowledge that someone had been in my sanctuary, breathing my air, studying my life with unknown intentions. As evening approached, the cologne smell seemed to grow stronger rather than dissipating. It clung to the air like smoke, defying logic and ventilation. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, certain I could feel eyes watching me from shadows that shouldn't exist. Every creak of the settling house made me freeze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Rex's behavior grew increasingly erratic as darkness fell. He would suddenly stop whatever he was doing and stare at empty corners, his ears perked forward as if hearing sounds that escaped my human perception. His low whines and occasional sharp barks created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that made rational thought nearly impossible. Sleep was out of the question. I positioned myself in my living room where I could see both the front door and the hallway leading to the basement. Every shadow seemed to writhe with potential threat. Every sound from outside, a car door slamming, footsteps on sidewalk, the distant hum of traffic, sent adrenaline spiking through my system like liquid fire. Around midnight, I heard it. The soft squeak of hinges that desperately needed oil. The basement door was opening. Rex was on his feet instantly, every hair on his body standing at attention. His growl filled the room with barely contained violence, a sound that spoke to thousands of years of predator and prey dynamics. I sat frozen in my chair, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. The house felt different now, as if the air pressure had changed. The cologne smell intensified until it was almost choking, mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. My hands gripped the arms of my chair so tightly that my knuckles ached, white bone showing through stretched skin. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, ascending from below. But that was impossible. I had checked the basement door after dinner. It had been locked. I had turned the deadbolt myself, had tested it twice to be certain. Rex's barking reached a crescendo of fury and fear, but he made no move toward the hallway. Even his protective instincts couldn't overcome whatever primal terror was radiating from that direction. His loyalty warred with his survival instincts, leaving him trembling and torn in the middle of my living room. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs, paused, then began moving down my hallway with purpose that made my blood run cold. Each step seemed to last an eternity, building tension like a symphony of dread. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out rational thought. Then silence. Complete suffocating silence that was somehow worse than the sounds that had preceded it. I sat in that silence for what felt like hours, my body rigid with anticipation, waiting for something terrible to emerge from the shadows of my own home. When I finally found the courage to investigate, the hallway was empty. The basement door stood closed and locked, exactly as I had left it. No sign of disturbance, no evidence of intrusion, only that damned cologne smell lingering in the air like a signature left by an invisible visitor. But in the morning, I found them. Wet footprints leading from my basement door to my back door, then out across my deck where they disappeared into the dew-covered grass. Size 11 boot prints that matched perfectly with the impression I had found in my workshop sawdust. Lucas was gone when I looked toward his house. His driveway empty, his windows dark as if he had never existed at all. The for sale sign that appeared in his yard later that week confirmed what I already suspected, that whatever had been happening in my house was over, at least for now. But the basement door still requires 2 deadbolts, and Rex still refuses to go downstairs. The cologne smell returns sometimes on humid nights, faint but unmistakable, reminding me that some violations leave marks that never fully heal. I've learned to sleep with one eye open, to trust my dog's instincts over my rational mind, and to never assume that locked doors are enough to keep the darkness at bay. The worst part isn't the fear. It's the knowledge that someone had been studying me, learning my routines, mapping my vulnerabilities with the patience of a predator. Somewhere out there, Lucas carries memories of my basement, my tools, my life laid bare for his inspection. That violation follows me everywhere now, a shadow that no amount of light can fully dispel. Story 9. The fluorescent lights above never stop humming, never stop flickering, casting sickly shadows that dance across the empty corridors of Westfield Shopping Center. At 2:17 a.m., the mall becomes something else entirely. A hollow shell where every footstep echoes like gunshots, and every reflection in the darkened storefronts seems to move just a fraction of a second after you do. I've been working security here for 8 months now, walking these same roads, checking these same doors, watching the same surveillance monitors display their grainy black and white feeds of absolutely nothing. But tonight feels different. Tonight the air tastes metallic, like blood mixed with the stale recycled oxygen that pumps through the ventilation system. Tonight, I can't shake the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with this place. My name is Marcus, and I'm about to tell you why I'm updating my resume tomorrow morning. The first sign came at midnight, right when my shift officially began. I was making my initial rounds, clipboard in hand, when I noticed one of the toy store displays had been rearranged. The stuffed animals that usually faced the walkway were all turned around, their backs to the glass, as if they were looking into the store instead of out at potential customers. The teddy bears, the rabbits, the puppies, all of them staring inward with their button eyes and stitched smiles hidden from view. My heart rate picked up slightly, that familiar flutter you get when something isn't quite right. I told myself it was probably the cleaning crew playing a prank, maybe some teenager who got locked in accidentally and decided to mess around. But as I reached for my keys to unlock the gate and fix the display, every single stuffed animal slowly turned back around in perfect unison. The sound of my clipboard hitting the floor echoed through the empty mall like a thunderclap. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, staring at those innocent toy faces that now seemed to be studying me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. My mouth went completely dry, and I could feel sweat beginning to beat on my forehead despite the air conditioning that kept the mall at a constant 68 degrees. I told myself I was seeing things. 8 months of night shifts will mess with your head, make you see movement where there isn't any, create patterns where none exist. I picked up my clipboard with hands that were trembling just slightly and continued my rounds, but I made a mental note to avoid that particular store for the rest of the night. The second incident happened an hour later in the food court. I was walking past the Pretzel Palace when I heard the soft ding of a microwave finishing its cycle. The sound came from behind the counter, clear as day, followed by the mechanical whir of the rotating plate coming to a stop. Every hair on my arm stood up because I knew for a fact that the power to all food court vendors gets shut off at closing time. It's part of my nightly checklist. I approached the counter slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness behind the service area. The microwave's digital display showed €0, just like it should, but the interior light was on, and the glass plate was still rotating slowly, as if someone had just opened the door and interrupted the cycle. Steam was rising from something inside, something that smelled like cinnamon and sugar, warm and inviting and completely impossible. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out the constant hum of the ventilation system. I reached across the counter with a shaking hand and pulled the microwave door open. Empty. Completely empty, but still warm to the touch, still smelling of fresh-baked goods that shouldn't exist. That's when I heard the voice for the first time. The old man appeared near the Spencer's storefront, materializing from the shadows like he'd been standing there all along waiting for me to notice him. He was exactly what you'd picture if someone said, "kindly grandfather." White beard neatly trimmed, cardigan sweater despite the constant temperature, wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light from my flashlight. His presence should have been comforting, but something about his smile made my stomach clench with dread. He explained that he'd been coming to the mall after hours for years, that he enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere when all the shoppers were gone. His voice was warm and grandfatherly, but there was an undercurrent to it that made my skin feel like it was crawling with invisible insects. He talked about how the mall during the day was full of dishonest people, shoplifters, employees who called in sick when they weren't really ill, teenagers who vandalized property and denied it when confronted. The old man suggested that I had the power to fix all of that. All I had to do was lock all the entrances a little early the next evening, before closing time. Just 15 minutes early. Anyone who tried to leave and found the doors locked would learn a valuable lesson about honesty, he explained. Those who had nothing to hide would simply wait patiently. Those who had been dishonest would reveal their true nature through panic and desperation. I told him that was impossible, that it would be kidnapping, that people could get hurt. The words came out of my mouth in a rush, my voice higher than normal because my throat felt like it was closing up. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from this man, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. His response was to nod understandingly and mention that he'd be back tomorrow night to ask again. He hoped I would reconsider, he said, because the mall really needed someone who cared about justice and honesty. Then he walked away toward the main entrance, his footsteps making no sound on the tile floor. I followed him at a distance, my flashlight beam jumping around nervously as my hands shook. By the time I reached the entrance, he was gone. The doors were still locked from the inside, the same way I'd left them at the beginning of my shift. Security footage from the cameras trained on the entrance showed nothing but empty corridors. The rest of that shift passed without incident, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept finding myself stopping to listen for sounds that shouldn't be there, spinning around to check shadows that seemed too deep, too dark. Every reflection in every storefront window made me jump. By the time my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I was exhausted and on edge, my nerves frayed like old rope. I went home and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that old man's face. That smile that was just a little too wide. Those eyes that seemed to see more than they should. I called my supervisor and reported the incident, describing it as a possible break-in, but without any evidence of forced entry or theft. There wasn't much anyone could do except add an extra note to the incident log. The next night, I arrived at work 45 minutes early and did a thorough inspection of the entire mall. Every door, every window, every emergency exit, all secure. I checked the security cameras, reviewed the footage from the previous evening, and found absolutely nothing. No old man, no evidence that anyone had been in the building except me. But at 1:30 a.m., he was back. This time he appeared near the jewelry store, standing perfectly still with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the display of wedding rings and necklaces like he was window shopping. My stomach dropped when I saw him, a physical sensation like falling that made me dizzy and nauseous. I approached him slowly, every muscle in my body tense and ready to run. He greeted me like an old friend, asking how my day had been, mentioning that he'd been thinking about our conversation from the night before. His tone was conversational, pleasant, but there was something underneath it that made my spine feel like it was made of ice. He wondered if I'd had time to consider his suggestion about locking the doors early. I told him again that I couldn't do that it was illegal and wrong and dangerous. My voice was steadier this time, but my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. The old man nodded thoughtfully and mentioned that he understood my hesitation, but that sometimes doing the right thing required difficult choices. He talked about how many dishonest people visited the mall every day, how they lied to their families, their employers, their friends. Wouldn't it be better if they faced consequences for their dishonesty? Wouldn't the world be a better place if people were forced to confront their lies? The way he spoke about it made my blood feel like it was turning to ice water in my veins. There was a passion in his voice when he talked about punishing liars, an enthusiasm that was absolutely terrifying. I backed away from him slowly, my hand moving toward the radio on my belt, but he held up one finger and asked me to wait just a moment longer. He wanted to show me something, he said. Something that would help me understand why his plan was so important. He pointed toward the second floor, toward the electronics store that had a large display window facing the main corridor below. There was something up there that I needed to see. Something that would change my mind about helping him. I looked up toward the second floor, my flashlight beam sweeping across the storefronts 30 feet above us. Everything looked normal, quiet, empty. When I looked back down, the old man was gone again. Vanished. Like he'd never been there at all. But this time, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving along the second floor, directly above where we'd been standing. The sound echoed through the empty mall, each step distinct and measured. I pointed my flashlight upward again, but the beam wasn't strong enough to illuminate the upper level clearly. I made my way to the escalators, which were shut down for the night, and climbed them step by step. The metal stairs creaked under my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. My breathing was coming in short, sharp bursts, and I could taste copper in my mouth from the adrenaline flooding my system. The second floor was darker than the main level, with fewer security lights and more shadows. I moved slowly along the corridor, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, searching for any sign of the old man. Every store was locked and secure, their metal security gates pulled down and padlocked. But the footsteps continued, always staying just ahead of me, just around the next corner. I followed the sound to the electronics store, the one with the large display window that faced the main corridor below. The security gate was down, but through the gaps I could see the glow of various electronic devices on standby. The footsteps stopped right in front of the store. I called out, asking if anyone was there, my voice echoing off the walls and ceiling. No response, just the constant hum of the air conditioning and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights. I stood there for several minutes, listening, waiting, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. That's when I heard the scratching. It was soft at first, barely audible over the ambient noise of the building's systems, a gentle scraping sound, like fingernails on glass, coming from the display window. I pressed my face against the security gate, trying to see through the gaps, and that's when I saw him. The old man was standing inside the store, on the other side of the display window, facing outward toward the corridor. But that was impossible. The store was locked, the security gate was down, and I could see every entrance and exit. He couldn't be in there, but he was, and he was looking directly at me with that same too-wide smile, his face pressed close to the glass of the display window. His white beard was spread against the surface, and he was moving his head slowly from side to side, rubbing his facial hair against the glass in a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. The scratching sound was his beard against the window. My heart nearly stopped. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering wildly as my hands shook uncontrollably. The scratching continued, steady and deliberate, like he was trying to wear through the glass with nothing but the coarse hair of his beard. His eyes never left mine, and his smile never wavered. I turned and ran toward the escalators, my footsteps echoing through the empty corridor like gunshots. Behind me, the scratching continued, growing louder and more frantic. I reached the top of the escalator and looked back. The old man was still there, still rubbing his beard against the glass, but now his hands were pressed against the window as well, and I could see his breath fogging the surface. I took the escalator steps 3 at a time, nearly falling in my haste to reach the main level. Once I was downstairs, I looked up toward the electronics store window. I could still see him there, a pale figure silhouetted against the dim glow of the electronics inside the store. The scratching sound carried down to where I stood, echoing off the walls and ceiling. But then I realized something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The electronics store was on the inside of the second floor, facing the central corridor. The display window looked down into the mall's main area where I was standing. But for the old man to be rubbing his beard against that window, he would have to be floating 30 feet above the ground on the outside of the building. The display window faced inward, into the mall. There was no outside ledge, no balcony, nothing that would allow someone to stand against that window from the exterior. The old man was somehow standing in midair, 3 stories above the parking lot, pressing his face against the glass from the outside of a window that faced inside. I ran to my security desk and grabbed my radio, calling for backup, for police, for anyone who would listen. My voice was shaking so badly I could barely form words. The dispatcher asked me to repeat my location and the nature of the emergency several times because my report wasn't making sense. How do you explain that an impossible old man is floating outside a second-story window, rubbing his beard against the glass while staring at you with eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. I stayed at my desk for the rest of the shift, watching the security monitors and jumping at every shadow, every flicker of the fluorescent lights. The scratching sound continued for another 20 minutes before finally stopping. When I looked at the monitor that covered the electronics store, the window was empty, but on the glass, visible even through the grainy black and white security camera, were streaks and smudges, where something had been rubbing against the surface from the outside. My replacement found me sitting at the desk at 6 a.m., still staring at the monitors, my hands shaking and my shirt soaked with sweat. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to me. He looked at me with concern and suggested I might want to take a few days off, maybe see a doctor. I never went back. 3 weeks later, I heard on the news that Westfield Shopping Center had experienced a technical malfunction with their electronic door locks during peak shopping hours. All the exits had somehow locked simultaneously for exactly 15 minutes, trapping hundreds of customers inside during the evening rush. The news report mentioned that while most people remained calm, several shoppers had panic attacks, and one man had broken down completely, confessing to his wife about an affair he'd been hiding for months. The malfunction was blamed on a computer glitch in the security system. No explanation was ever found for how all the doors could lock at once when they were designed with multiple fail-safes to prevent exactly that scenario. I know better. Somewhere in that mall there's a kindly old man with a white beard and a smile that's just a little too wide. He's still asking the night security guards to lock the doors early, still talking about justice and honesty and the importance of punishing those who lie. And eventually, one of them is going to say yes. I work at a bank now, during normal daytime hours, surrounded by people and sunshine and surveillance cameras that actually show what's really there. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I still hear that soft scratching sound, like fingernails on glass, like a beard rubbing against a window that can't possibly be reached from the outside. And I know that somewhere, somehow, he's still out there, still waiting, still smiling, still watching for the next person who might be willing to help him teach the world about the consequences of dishonesty. I just pray it's never going to be me. Story 10. The hammering started on the third night of my quarantine, echoing through the farmhouse walls, like the desperate heartbeat of something buried alive. I had arrived at Aunt Margaret's estate with nothing but a suitcase and 14 days of mandatory isolation ahead of me. The sprawling colonial farmhouse sat like a weathered sentinel against the Pennsylvania countryside, its white paint peeling in long strips that reminded me of dead skin. Margaret had left for her sister's place in Florida the day before my arrival, leaving me detailed instructions about which rooms to avoid and which pantry shelves held the canned goods. The servants' wing, she had mentioned in passing, was sealed off for renovations that had been postponed indefinitely. The isolation should have been peaceful. I had brought enough books to last a month. My laptop hummed with unfinished projects, and the kitchen was well stocked. But peace, I discovered, was a luxury this house refused to provide. On that first night, I had chosen the master bedroom on the second floor, partly for its size, and partly because it offered a clear view of the long gravel driveway. If anyone approached, I would see their headlights cutting through the darkness long before they reached the house. The bedroom sat at the opposite end of the building from the sealed servants' wing, separated by a long hallway lined with family portraits whose eyes seemed to track my movements in the dim light. The hammering began at 2:17 a.m. I knew the exact time because I had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful, metal striking wood with the steady persistence of someone building something, or tearing it down. My heart began its frantic dance against my ribs as I sat up in bed, straining to locate the source. The sound seemed to emanate from deep within the house, muffled by layers of plaster and old timber. I counted the strikes. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short again. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. I slipped from the bed, my bare feet meeting the cold hardwood floor. The house was draped in shadows, and I realized I had forgotten to leave any lights on. My phone's flashlight cut a weak beam through the darkness as I crept toward the hallway. The hammering continued, growing slightly louder as I moved toward the servants' wing. Margaret had sealed the entrance with plastic sheeting and yellow caution tape, the kind used at construction sites. A handwritten sign warned of structural damage and unsafe conditions, but the plastic barrier rippled gently, as if disturbed by air currents from within. The hammering was definitely coming from behind that barrier. I pressed my ear to the plastic, feeling it cold and clammy against my skin. The sound was clearer now. Deliberate, measured strikes that seemed to follow a pattern I couldn't quite decipher. My rational mind searched for explanations. Pipes expanding in the cold, settling timbers. Perhaps a window left open somewhere allowing wind to rattle loose boards. But rational minds, I was learning, were poor companions in the dark hours before dawn. The hammering stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt heavy in my chest. I stood there for several minutes, my breath creating small clouds in the chill air, waiting for the sound to resume. When it didn't, I returned to the bedroom and spent the remaining hours until sunrise staring at the door, jumping at every creak and groan the old house made. Daylight brought temporary relief. I called Margaret's cell phone and left a rambling voicemail about noises in the sealed wing, trying to keep my voice casual. She called back within an hour, her tone patient but dismissive. The house was over 200 years old, she reminded me. Old houses made sounds. The servants' wing had been sealed because of water damage from the previous winter, rotting floorboards, compromised supports. Perhaps small animals had found their way inside. She would have someone check on it when I finished my quarantine. Her explanation should have reassured me, but something in her voice suggested she was reading from a script she had rehearsed many times before. The second night I was ready. I had positioned a chair in the hallway near the sealed entrance, armed with my phone to record whatever I heard. The hammering began again at exactly 2:17 a.m., the same pattern, the same rhythm. But this time, I noticed something else. The plastic barrier wasn't just rippling, it was bulging outward, as if something inside was pressing against it. I fumbled for my phone's record button, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped the device. The hammering continued for 17 minutes exactly, then stopped with the same abrupt finality as the night before. When I played back the recording the next morning, I heard only silence punctuated by my own ragged breathing. It was on the fourth night that I first saw her. I had given up trying to record the sounds and instead positioned myself at the window in the front parlor, hoping to spot any vehicles that might explain the disturbances. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the grounds and the long veranda that wrapped around three sides of the house. The wooden boards of the veranda gleamed like polished bone in the moonlight. That's when I noticed the footprints. They appeared one by one, dark impressions on the pale wood, as if someone invisible was walking the length of the veranda. But these weren't ordinary footprints. They were thick, caked with what looked like wet earth or mud, and they left behind a trail that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. My mouth went dry as cotton as I pressed my face to the window, breath fogging the glass. The footprints continued their deliberate path, turning the corner toward the back of the house. I grabbed my phone and raced to the back windows, arriving just in time to see the prints continuing along the rear veranda. Then I saw her. She was translucent, like looking at someone through several layers of gauze or morning fog. Her form wavered slightly, as if she existed just outside the normal spectrum of reality. She wore a long dress that might have been white once, but now appeared gray and tattered. Her hair hung in long, wet strands, and her feet, God, her feet, were caked with thick, dark mud that left those impossible prints with each step. I raised my phone to photograph her, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the device steady. Through the camera's screen, she appeared even more ethereal, almost invisible, but the mud prints were clear and distinct, dark stains against the pale wood. I pressed the shutter button, the camera's flash briefly illuminating the veranda. When my eyes readjusted to the darkness, she was gone. But the footprints remained, glistening wetly in the moonlight. I must have stood there for 20 minutes, phone pressed to the window, waiting for her to reappear. When she didn't, I made my way outside through the kitchen door, my bare feet instantly numbed by the cold wooden boards of the veranda. The prints were real. I could feel the moisture in them, the gritty texture of mud, and something else I didn't want to identify. I followed them around the entire perimeter of the house, documenting each one with my camera. But when I reviewed the photos, they showed only clean, dry wooden boards. The prints that I could see clearly with my naked eyes simply didn't exist in any photograph. The fifth night brought a change in the pattern. The hammering began earlier, 11:43 p.m., and was accompanied by other sounds. Scraping as if heavy furniture was being dragged across the floor, the groaning of stressed wood, and underneath it all a sound that made my blood freeze, weeping. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, rising and falling in the rhythm of inconsolable grief. I found myself drawn to the sealed entrance despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away. The plastic barrier was billowing outward more dramatically now, as if something large was moving around inside the wing. I pressed my ear to the barrier again and immediately recoiled. The plastic was warm, not just room temperature, but genuinely warm, as if heated from within. The weeping grew louder, more desperate, punctuated now by words I couldn't quite make out. My phone rang, the sudden sound in the darkness nearly stopping my heart. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, which was impossible. It was nearly midnight, and she had never called me this late. I answered with a trembling voice, but heard only static. Underneath the electronic noise, I could swear I heard the same weeping that was coming from behind the barrier. The call lasted 37 seconds before cutting to silence. When I checked my call log the next morning, there was no record of any incoming call. The sixth night, I discovered I wasn't alone in the house. I had barricaded myself in the master bedroom, pushing the heavy dresser in front of the door. The hammering and weeping had become a nightly symphony that I could no longer pretend to ignore. My hands shook constantly now, and I had developed a twitch in my left eyelid that wouldn't stop. I was dozing fitfully when I heard footsteps in the hallway, not the ethereal padding of my translucent visitor, but the solid, deliberate tread of someone wearing boots. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door, and I held my breath so completely that black spots began to dance at the edges of my vision. The doorknob turned slowly, pressing against the dresser I had positioned as a barrier. When it met resistance, the pressure increased. The heavy furniture scraped against the floor as someone, pushed against the door with inhuman strength. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering frantically into the device. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional as she took my information, promising to send a patrol car immediately. But even as I gave my location, I could hear that horrible weeping in the background of the call, as if it was coming through the phone's speaker rather than from the sealed wing. The pushing stopped abruptly when I mentioned the police. The footsteps retreated down the hallway, and I heard the front door open and close with deliberate care. When the patrol car arrived 20 minutes later, the officers found no sign of forced entry, no footprints around the house, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. But I had noticed something they missed. In the morning light, I could see that the yellow caution tape across the servants' wing entrance had been carefully cut and retaped, as if someone had entered and tried to conceal their presence. The seventh night, I made a decision that would haunt me far longer than my remaining week of quarantine. I was going into the sealed wing. I found a utility knife in Margaret's kitchen drawer and carefully cut through the plastic barrier, peeling it back just enough to slip through. The air inside was thick and humid, carrying the smell of damp earth and something sickeningly sweet that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. My phone's flashlight revealed a hallway lined with servant quarters, their doors standing open like hungry mouths. The wallpaper hung in long, water-damaged strips, and the floorboards sagged ominously under my weight. But there was no structural damage that I could see, no reason for the wing to be sealed off. The hammering sounds were coming from the room at the end of the hall. As I approached, I could see flickering light beneath the door. Not electric light, but the warm, dancing glow of candles or oil lamps. The weeping was clearer now, interspersed with words I could finally understand. She was saying my name. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for the door handle. The metal was ice cold against my palm. so cold it almost burned. I turned the handle slowly and pushed the door open. The room was empty except for a single wooden chair positioned in the center of the space. But the hammering continued all around me, as if invisible workers were renovating the walls and ceiling. The weeping echoed from every corner, growing louder as I stepped inside. Then I saw her again, clearer than ever before. She stood in the far corner, no longer translucent but solid and real. Her dress was indeed white, though stained with mud and something darker. Her hair hung wet and stringy around a face that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. When she looked at me, her eyes held a recognition that made my knees weak. She began to speak, but her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in my bones rather than my ears. She told me about the house, about the things that had happened in this room, about the reason the wing had been sealed. She spoke of love turned to obsession, of promises broken and debts unpaid. She spoke of waiting, always waiting, for someone who understood. The hammering reached a crescendo, and I realized it wasn't construction sounds at all. It was the sound of someone trying to break free, to claw their way out of a prison that existed between moments, between the spaces where reality grew thin. As dawn approached, she began to fade again, becoming translucent once more. But before she disappeared entirely, she reached out to touch my face with fingers that felt like ice and earth and sorrow. Her touch left no mark that cameras could capture, but I felt it burning on my skin for days afterward. I stumbled from the room and resealed the plastic barrier, my hands moving with mechanical precision despite their trembling. I spent the remaining days of my quarantine in the kitchen, avoiding the upstairs entirely. The hammering continued each night, but I no longer investigated. Some doors I had learned were sealed for good reason. When Margaret returned, she found me waiting on the front porch with my suitcase packed. I told her I had experienced some minor disturbances, but nothing serious. She nodded with the expression of someone who had heard similar reports before and asked no follow-up questions. As I loaded my car, I noticed she had already contacted a contractor. A van with barrier solutions painted on the side was parked in the driveway, and workers were unloading additional plastic sheeting and stronger warning signs, the kind used for hazardous materials rather than simple structural damage. I drove away without looking back, but I carry the memory of that touch with me everywhere. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear the hammering, not from any external source, but from somewhere deep inside my own chest, as if she had left something behind when she touched me. A reminder that some forms of isolation have nothing to do with quarantine, and some hauntings follow you home. Story 11. The first bottle rolled to my feet 3 weeks after Marcus died. I'd been drinking alone at Murphy's Tavern, the same dive where we used to celebrate our weekend rides before the asphalt took him from me. The amber bottle made no sound as it approached, just a smooth, deliberate glide across the sticky floor until it touched my boot. When I looked around for who might have kicked it, the bar was nearly empty, and the few remaining patrons sat hunched over their drinks, lost in their own misery. I told myself it was nothing. Bars are slippery places where things slide around. Physics and alcohol make strange bedfellows, but the coldness that crept up my spine suggested otherwise, a warning that I was too drunk and too grief-stricken to heed. Now, 2 months later, I can't escape the truth that settles in my gut like rotten food every time I walk through Murphy's doors. The bottles know when I've had too much. They roll to me like loyal dogs returning to their master, except these glass messengers carry warnings instead of comfort. Tonight feels different, though. Tonight, the air inside Murphy's hangs thick and electric, charged with something that makes my teeth ache. The fluorescent lights above the bar flicker with irregular stutters, casting shadows that seem to writhe and dance when I'm not looking directly at them. My hands shake as I lift the whiskey to my lips, not from the alcohol, but from the certainty that something terrible is building around me. The bartender, a grizzled man named Eddie, who's worked these same 4 walls for 20 years, keeps glancing at the electrical panel behind the bar. Earlier, he'd mentioned that the wiring had been acting up all week, throwing sparks whenever he tried to adjust the dimmer switches. "The building's old," he'd said, "probably older than both of us combined." But tonight, the way his eyes dart nervously between the panel and the ceiling suggests he's thinking the same thing I am, that the building seems to be holding its breath, waiting for something. I'm 3 drinks deep when the first bottle makes its move. A Budweiser, empty and forgotten under someone's table, begins its slow journey across the floor. My heart hammers against my ribs as I watch it navigate around chair legs and avoid other obstacles with impossible precision. The rational part of my mind screams about optical illusions and alcohol-induced hallucinations, but my gut knows better. My gut recognizes Marcus in that bottle's movement, the same careful precision he used when threading his Harley through traffic, the same purposeful grace that made him seem invincible right up until the moment the truck ran the red light. The bottle stops against my left boot. I drain my glass in response, hoping the alcohol will dull whatever message is coming. It doesn't work. If anything, the whiskey sharpens my awareness, making every sound in the bar, the hum of the ancient jukebox, the low murmur of conversation, the periodic sizzle from the electrical panel, seem amplified and somehow threatening. A second bottle joins the first. This one comes from the far end of the bar, rolling with that same deliberate intent. It's a wine bottle, green glass that catches the overhead light and throws it back in fractured rainbows. As it approaches, I notice that Eddie has stopped wiping down glasses and is staring at something behind me. When I turn to follow his gaze, I see nothing but empty tables and the exit door, its red neon sign casting everything nearby in a bloody glow. But Eddie keeps staring, his face pale under the harsh lights. He tells me later that he thought he saw someone standing by the door, a tall figure in a leather jacket who looked familiar but wrong somehow, like a photograph that's been slightly overexposed. By the time I turn back around, Eddie's already reached for the phone, presumably to call someone about the electrical problems that are making the lights behave like strobe effects at a dance club. The third bottle arrives as I'm ordering my 4th drink. This time I watch its entire journey, mesmerized by the way it slides between tables and patrons without anyone noticing. A woman in a business suit talks animatedly on her phone, oblivious as the bottle passes within inches of her high heels. 2 construction workers argue about football while the glass messenger navigates around their steel-toed boots. It's as if I'm the only one who can see these bottles making their pilgrimage to my feet. My mouth feels dry despite the alcohol, and my palms are slick with sweat that has nothing to do with the bar's stuffy atmosphere. The bottles are forming a small collection around my stool, but they're not arranged randomly. Even in my increasingly intoxicated state, I can see they're positioning themselves deliberately, like chess pieces moving into formation for some cosmic endgame. The 4th bottle clinches it. This one's different, not empty like the others, but half full of something dark that sloshes with each rolling movement. As it approaches, I catch a whiff of motor oil and burning rubber, smells that transport me instantly back to that Sunday morning when Marcus and I had planned to ride up the coast. The morning when his bike wouldn't start, and he'd spent an hour in his garage trying to diagnose the problem while I waited outside, growing impatient in the California sun. He'd been frustrated with the bike's refusal to cooperate, which was unusual for him. Marcus could coax life from any machine, could hear problems in an engine's rhythm before they became serious. But that morning, something was off, not just with the Harley, but with everything. The birds seemed too quiet, the air too still. Even the neighborhood dogs, usually eager to bark at any disturbance, watched our mechanical struggles in unusual silence. Eventually, Marcus gave up on the bike and suggested we take mine instead. We'd switch off riding, he said, make a whole day of it. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. His bike, the one that had carried him safely through thousands of miles, chose that morning to break down. The borrowed bike he died on ran perfectly until the moment impact turned it into scrap metal and twisted dreams. Now, watching this half-full bottle roll toward me, I taste that morning's motor oil and frustration in the back of my throat. The bottle stops next to its companions, completing what I can now clearly see is an arrow formation. 4 bottles, positioned with geometric precision, all pointing toward the exit door where Eddie thought he saw someone standing. The air in Murphy's has become noticeably warmer, and there's a smell that wasn't there before, something acrid and sharp that makes my nose burn. Several patrons have started coughing, and I notice Eddie stepping away from the electrical panel with increasing frequency. The lights overhead aren't just flickering now. They're strobing in patterns that make my vision swim and my head pound. I try to stand, but my legs feel disconnected from my brain, heavy and unresponsive. The whiskey has settled in my bloodstream like lead, making every movement feel underwater. But the bottles at my feet seem to pulse with urgency, and when I look at them again, I swear I can see my own reflection multiplied in their curved surfaces. Dozens of distorted versions of myself, all looking terrified. That's when I hear it. The sound of an engine, muffled but unmistakable. It's coming from outside, but it sounds like Marcus's Harley, that distinctive rumble that I'd recognize anywhere. My hands start shaking so violently that I can barely grip my glass. The logical part of my mind insists it's just another motorcycle passing by. But logic has been unreliable lately, especially when alcohol and grief combine to play tricks on my perception. The engine sound grows louder, then cuts off abruptly. In the sudden silence that follows, I become aware of how quiet the bar has become. The construction workers have stopped arguing. The woman has ended her phone call. Even the ancient jukebox has fallen silent, its colorful lights still cycling but no music emerging from its speakers. Eddie's voice cuts through the tension when he announces that he's calling the fire department about the electrical problems. His words seem to come from far away, even though he's standing just a few feet behind the bar. He mentions something about burning smells and sparking wires, but I'm not really listening. My attention is fixed on the bottles at my feet and the growing certainty that I need to move, need to follow their arrow-shaped guidance before something terrible happens. The smell of burning becomes stronger, no longer subtle but sharp and immediate. Smoke begins to curl from behind the bar, thin wisps at first, then thicker clouds that make everyone start coughing in earnest. Eddie's voice rises in panic as he shouts for everyone to stay calm, but his own terror is evident in the way his words crack and stumble. I force myself to stand, my legs wobbling but functional. The bottles at my feet seem to shimmer in the increasingly chaotic light, their arrow formation now unmistakable. They're pointing toward the exit, toward escape, toward survival. As I take my first unsteady step in that direction, I feel a presence beside me. Not visible, but tangible somehow, like standing next to someone in a crowded elevator. The presence guides me through the growing chaos as other patrons begin to realize that the electrical problems have escalated into something dangerous. People are moving toward the exit now, but slowly, without the urgency that grips me. They can't see what I see, can't feel what I feel. They don't have bottles guiding them or the ghost of a dead friend pushing them toward safety. Behind me, I hear the first real crack of electrical failure, a sharp pop followed by a shower of sparks that illuminates the bar in harsh white light. Someone screams. Glass breaks. The acrid smell of burning plastic fills my nostrils as I stumble toward the door, following the path laid out by 4 empty bottles and the invisible presence of someone who died because I wasn't there to watch his back. I reach the exit just as the lights behind me explode in a cascade of electrical fire. The door handle is warm under my palm, almost hot, and when I push through into the cool night air, I can hear Eddie shouting about everyone getting out, about calling the fire department, about how lucky they are that someone noticed the smoke early. But I know it wasn't luck. As I stand on the sidewalk, watching flames begin to lick at Murphy's windows, I understand that Marcus is still watching out for me, still trying to keep me safe even from beyond whatever barrier separates us. The bottles were his warning, his way of telling me to leave before the building became my tomb. The fire department arrives within minutes, their sirens wailing through the night. No one is seriously hurt. A few people treated for smoke inhalation, some minor burns from the electrical explosion, but nothing worse. Everyone calls it a miracle, a fortunate coincidence that the evacuation happened when it did. I don't call it a miracle. I call it friendship that transcends death, loyalty that burns brighter than any electrical fire. And as I walk home through streets that smell like smoke and regret, I make a promise to the night air and to Marcus's memory. I'll stop drinking myself toward joining him. I'll find another way to deal with the guilt and grief. I'll start living again, because that's what he's been trying to tell me with every bottle that's rolled to my feet. Some warnings come from unexpected messengers. Some guardian angels wear leather jackets and ride motorcycles. And sometimes the dead love us enough to keep saving us from ourselves, one rolling bottle at a time. The next morning, I'll read in the newspaper that the fire investigators found evidence of faulty wiring that had been sparking for weeks, building toward the inevitable electrical explosion that consumed Murphy's Tavern. They'll call it a tragedy averted, a disaster that could have been much worse. But I'll know the real story. I'll know that friendship doesn't end with death, and that some debts can only be repaid by learning to live again. The bottles have stopped rolling, but their message remains clear. It's time to choose life over the slow suicide of grief and alcohol. It's time to honor Marcus not by following him into darkness, but by finding my way back to the light. Story 12. The fence between our properties wasn't meant to keep anything out. It was meant to keep something in. I should have realized this the moment I saw my neighbor standing at the property line that first evening, his fingers wrapped around the chain link like he was gripping prison bars from the wrong side. The metal sang a low, discordant note as his knuckles shifted against it, and something about that sound made my stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. The moving truck had just pulled away, leaving me alone with boxes and the suffocating quiet that only rural areas can provide. I'd bought the place sight unseen, a desperate escape from city life after the breakdown, after Sarah left, after everything collapsed into a series of sleepless nights and pills that stopped working. The realtor had mentioned the neighbor, an older man who kept to himself, raised sheep, harmless enough. What she hadn't mentioned was the way he watched. He stood there for nearly 20 minutes that first evening, motionless except for the slow, methodical movement of his fingers against the fence. I pretended to unload boxes from my car, stealing glances when I thought he wasn't looking. But every time I turned my head, those pale eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When darkness finally forced me inside, I could still feel his presence lingering at the fence line like a bad smell that wouldn't dissipate. The introduction came 3 days later. I was attempting to organize my makeshift home office when I heard footsteps crunching across the gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched him approach. Tall, gaunt, wearing overalls that hung loose on his frame like skin that no longer fit properly. His movements had an odd, shambling quality, as if his joints didn't quite connect the way they should. He knocked on my door with knuckles that rapped against the wood in an irregular rhythm, not quite human in its cadence. When I opened it, the smell hit me first. Something between wet wool and decay, sweet and nauseating. He introduced himself as Marcus, extended a hand that felt uncomfortably warm and slightly damp when I shook it. His grip lingered too long, thumb pressing against my pulse point, as if counting heartbeats. The conversation was stilted, filled with uncomfortable pauses where he would stare at me with those colorless eyes, head tilted slightly like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. He mentioned the sheep, how peaceful they were, how they helped him sleep at night. Then came the invitation. Would I like to see them sometime? Tomorrow evening, perhaps. He could give me a ride over to his property, show me around, introduce me to his flock. Something primitive in my brain screamed warnings. The way he said, introduce me to his flock, carried undertones that made my mouth go dry. I declined politely, mentioned being busy with the move. Maybe another time. His smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of disappointment that felt far too intense for such a minor rejection. After he left, I found myself checking the locks on my doors, pulling curtains closed, unable to shake the feeling that accepting his invitation would have been a profound mistake. That night, I dreamed of sheep with human voices calling my name in harmony, their woolly bodies moving in formations that hurt to look at directly. The incident started small, tools that I was certain I'd left in one place appearing in another. The garden hose coiled in patterns I didn't remember making, complex spirals that seemed to follow some kind of mathematical progression. Footprints in the soft soil near my kitchen window. Not quite the right shape, too narrow, with an extra indentation where toes should be. During the day, I could rationalize these things away. Fatigue from the move, stress, the general disorientation that comes with a major life change. But at night, when the world narrowed to the space between my bedroom walls and the darkness outside, rationality became a luxury I couldn't afford. I started hearing them around midnight. Soft sounds from the direction of Marcus's property. Not quite bleating, not quite human speech, but something that occupied the uncomfortable space between the two. The sounds carried on the wind with perfect clarity, as if the air itself was designed to transmit them directly to my ears. Sometimes I would catch fragments of what sounded like words, distorted and drawn out, pronunciation twisted into shapes that human mouths weren't meant to make. My sleep became fractured, broken into segments of uneasy unconsciousness, interrupted by periods of hyper-vigilant listening. During these wakeful intervals, I would lie rigid in bed, heart hammering against my ribs, straining to identify sounds that might be nothing more than wind through trees or the settling of old wood. But my body knew better. Adrenaline would flood my system with such intensity that my hands would shake for hours afterward, fingers tingling with excess energy that had nowhere to go. The fence began to rattle. It started as an occasional ping of metal against metal, easily dismissed as thermal expansion or small animals brushing against the chain link. But the sounds became more frequent, more purposeful, developing a rhythm that suggested deliberate manipulation. During the day, I would walk the property line, examining the fence for signs of tampering, finding nothing obviously wrong, yet unable to shake the conviction that something fundamental had changed. The rattling evolved into a symphony of metallic percussion that seemed to follow me as I moved around my property. When I worked in the garden, the sounds would emanate from the section of fence nearest to my location. When I sat on my back porch, the rattling would concentrate at the point where my yard met Marcus's land. It was as if something was tracking my movements, communicating my position through a complex code of metal against metal. I began to avoid the back portion of my property entirely, conducting all outdoor activities within sight of the front door, where I could retreat quickly if necessary. But even this precaution couldn't prevent the growing sensation of being watched, studied, cataloged for some purpose I couldn't begin to imagine. 2 weeks after Marcus's visit, the isolation became unbearable. I drove to town, desperate for human contact that didn't carry the weight of hidden agenda. At the hardware store, I mentioned my neighbor to the elderly clerk, described the sheep, the property layout, the general location. The man's face shifted into an expression of confused concern. He'd lived in the area his entire life, knew every resident within a 10-mile radius. There was no sheep farm on the road where I lived. The property adjacent to mine had been vacant for over 5 years, ever since the previous owner disappeared without explanation. The drive home felt endless, reality bending and reshaping itself with each mile. I'd seen the sheep with my own eyes, heard their sounds every night. I'd spoken to Marcus, shaken his hand, smelled the animal musk that clung to his clothes. Yet the hardware store clerk had been certain, unequivocal in his knowledge of the area. That night, I stood at my kitchen window, staring across the fence line toward Marcus's property. In the pale moonlight, I could make out shapes that might have been sheep moving in the distance, white forms drifting across dark pasture with an odd, synchronized movement that seemed choreographed rather than natural. But the more I stared, the more the shapes seemed to shift and blur, refusing to hold consistent form under sustained observation. I forced myself to turn away, to focus on anything else. But the image lingered. Those pale forms moving with purpose through the darkness, and the growing certainty that they were aware of my attention. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams where sheep spoke in human voices, and humans moved on all fours through moonlit fields. I woke repeatedly with the taste of wool in my mouth, and the sound of distant bleating that seemed to originate from inside my own skull. The night everything changed began like all the others, with me lying rigid in bed, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. But this time the sounds were different, closer, more distinct. The fence was rattling with mechanical precision, each metallic ping timed to match the rhythm of my accelerated heartbeat. Then came the scraping, something heavy being dragged across gravel, moving in slow circles around the perimeter of my property. The sound had weight to it, substance, like a body being pulled by reluctant limbs. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I strained to identify the source. Through the thin walls of my bedroom, every sound was amplified, distorted into something that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the lizard brain, screaming warnings about predators in the dark. Then I heard my name. It drifted through the night air like smoke, barely above a whisper, but unmistakably clear. Not called or shouted, but spoken in a conversational tone, as if whoever was saying it stood just outside my bedroom window. The voice was wrong, too deep, resonating from a chest cavity that seemed larger than human anatomy would allow. The sound repeated, my name stretched into syllables that hung in the air longer than physics should permit. Each repetition was accompanied by the scraping sound moving closer to my house, the rattling of chain link growing more violent, more insistent. I slid from bed on unsteady legs, every muscle in my body coiled with tension. My hands trembled as I crept toward the window, breath fogging the glass as I peered through the gap in the curtains. The moonlight revealed nothing but empty yard and the familiar silhouette of the fence line. But the sounds continued. My name whispered with increasing urgency, the scraping now directly outside my bedroom wall, and underneath it all, a new sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. Chain rattling, heavy links of metal dragging across gravel, accompanied by what could only be described as breathing. Deep, labored inhalations that seemed to draw in far more air than lungs should require. And then, cutting through the mechanical sounds of metal and chain, came something that destroyed what remained of my rational mind. A sound that was unmistakably a bleat, but wrong, distorted, emerging from a throat that had never been designed for such vocalizations. The sound was wet and organic, carrying overtones of human suffering that made my stomach lurch with sympathetic nausea. The combination of sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My name whispered with mechanical repetition, the dragging of chains, and that horrible bleating that seemed to come from something caught between human and animal, suffering in ways that neither species should have to endure. I pressed my back against the bedroom wall, as far from the window as I could get, heart hammering so violently that I was certain it could be heard from outside. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run, to get in my car and drive until the sun came up and the world made sense again. But my legs refused to cooperate, muscles locked in place by a terror so complete that movement seemed impossible. I could only stand there, listening to the impossible sounds and feeling my grip on reality slip away like water through cupped hands. When dawn finally came, the sounds stopped as abruptly as they had begun. I waited until full daylight before venturing outside, moving on legs that still shook with residual adrenaline. The yard showed no signs of disturbance, no footprints, no drag marks, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. But at the fence line, I found something that made my already churning stomach revolt completely. Twisted into the chain link at eye level were tufts of wool, white and clean as if freshly sheared. But mixed among the sheep's wool were strands of something else, coarse, dark hair that looked disturbingly human. And lower down, caught on a protruding wire, was a single link of heavy chain, still warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. I packed my belongings that same day, loading my car with shaking hands while constantly glancing toward the fence line. As I prepared to leave, I saw Marcus standing at his property line, watching my departure with an expression of profound disappointment. He raised one hand in farewell, and I could see chains wrapped around his wrist like jewelry, metal links catching the afternoon sunlight. Driving away, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of white shapes moving across his pasture, but they were walking upright, moving with the shambling gait of things that had forgotten how to be properly human. And in the distance, barely audible over the sound of my engine, I could hear my name being called in harmony by voices that had learned to bleat. I never returned to collect my security deposit. Some prices are too high to pay, and some invitations should never be accepted, no matter how innocent they appear. In the city, Surrounded by concrete and artificial light, I can almost convince myself it was all stress-induced hallucination. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I still hear chain link rattling in the wind and my name being whispered by throats that were never meant for human speech. And I know that somewhere, in a pasture that may or may not exist, something is still waiting to show me the sheep. Story 13. The needle shouldn't move on a turntable with no power, yet there it was at 3 a.m, scratching across vinyl that had been silent for months, filling my house with the melancholy wail of a bolero I'd never heard before. My chest tightened as the Spanish lyrics drifted through the walls, accompanied by the unmistakable scent of fresh tobacco smoke curling under my bedroom door. I had inherited the house from my Uncle Miguel 6 months ago, along with everything in it. The real estate agent had been blunt about the challenges of selling the property in this market, especially with all the outdated furnishings and that massive console stereo dominating the living room. The turntable was a relic from the 70s, its wood veneer cracked and speakers torn, clearly broken beyond repair. Yet here I was, heart hammering against my ribs, listening to it play music that couldn't possibly be playing. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood as I slipped out of bed, the familiar creak of the floorboards masked by the swelling orchestra emanating from downstairs. The song grew louder with each step I took toward the living room, as if the volume knob was turning itself up in anticipation of my arrival. My palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the banister, descending the stairs one careful step at a time. The living room was bathed in the pale blue glow of the turntable's display lights that had never worked before. The needle traced its path across a record I didn't recognize, the album cover obscured by shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The tobacco smell was stronger here, so thick I could taste it on my tongue, making my throat burn with each breath. I reached for the power button with a trembling finger, but before I could touch it, the music stopped. The needle lifted, the lights died, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the weight of the entire house pressing down on my shoulders. My mouth was desert dry as I stood there in the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to explain what I'd just witnessed. The next morning brought rational explanations. Old electronics could malfunction in strange ways. Neighbors might have powerful sound systems. The tobacco smell could be residue from my uncle's decades of smoking in the house. I repeated these explanations to myself while I made coffee, while I checked my email, while I called the real estate agent to discuss putting the house on the market. But the moment I mentioned selling, I heard it. The soft whisper of the needle finding its groove, followed by the opening notes of another bolero. This time, I was standing right next to the turntable, watching it happen. The needle moved with deliberate precision across a record that materialized from nowhere, its surface catching light that didn't exist in the room. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the floor as hot liquid splashed across my legs. The real estate agent's voice continued through the phone, asking if I was still there, but I couldn't respond. The music wrapped around me like smoke, and with it came the scent of tobacco so strong it made my eyes water. I hung up without saying goodbye, my hands shaking as I backed away from the turntable that now hummed with an energy that seemed to pulse through the floorboards and up into my bones. Days passed in a haze of sleepless nights and mounting paranoia. Every time I so much as thought about calling a moving company or browsing real estate listings online, the turntable would spring to life. The songs were always different, passionate boleros sung by voices that seemed to carry decades of longing and loss. But the tobacco smell remained constant, growing stronger with each occurrence until it felt like invisible hands were pressing lit cigarettes against my nostrils. I began to notice other things, the way shadows lingered in corners even when sunlight flooded the room, the subtle shift in temperature whenever I walked past the turntable, as if the air itself recoiled from my presence. The feeling of being watched intensified, starting as a slight prickle at the back of my neck, but evolving into a constant pressure that made my skin crawl with invisible insects. My appetite disappeared first, followed by my ability to concentrate on anything other than the turntable and its impossible music. Dark circles deepened under my eyes as I spent nights sitting across from the console, waiting for it to move, waiting for the music to start, waiting for whatever force inhabited this house to reveal itself. My hands developed a persistent tremor that worsened whenever I approached the living room. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. The few times I managed to drift off, I would wake to find myself standing in front of the turntable, my fingertips touching the needle as it played songs I'd never heard, but somehow knew by heart. The tobacco smell would be so overwhelming in these moments that I'd stumble to the bathroom and vomit, my body rejecting the phantom smoke that filled my lungs. 3 weeks into this nightmare, I decided to remove the turntable entirely. I called a junk removal service and arranged for them to come the following morning. That night, the music didn't stop. Song after song played without pause, each bolero bleeding into the next in an endless symphony of heartbreak and desire. The tobacco smell became so intense I could barely breathe, forcing me to crack windows despite the winter cold seeping in. But it wasn't just the music anymore. I began to hear footsteps on the upper floor, slow, deliberate steps that followed a pattern I recognized but couldn't place. The sound of a chair creaking in the dining room where no chair existed. The soft scrape of furniture being moved when I knew I was alone in the house. My rational mind cataloged these sounds as settling wood and expanding metal, but my body knew better. My nervous system had been pushed beyond its limits, flooding my bloodstream with adrenaline that left me jittery and hypersensitive to every sound. The junk removal team arrived at 8 in the morning, 2 burly men who took one look at the turntable and shook their heads. They claimed their truck had broken down outside my house, that their equipment had mysteriously malfunctioned, that they'd need to reschedule. I watched them leave through my front window, noting how quickly they walked back to their perfectly functional truck, how they kept glancing back at the house as they drove away. That afternoon, I tried to move the turntable myself. The moment my hands touched the wooden console, pain shot up my arms like electric current. Not the sharp bite of static electricity, but something deeper, a burning sensation that felt like it was coming from inside my bones. I jerked my hands away, gasping as the smell of tobacco intensified so dramatically that I couldn't see through the haze that suddenly filled the room. When the air cleared, I noticed the change. Every surface in the living room was now covered with a thin layer of ash, as if someone had been smoking continuously for hours. But it wasn't random. The ash formed patterns, swirls and curves that looked almost like handwriting in a language I couldn't read. My breathing became shallow and rapid as I stared at these markings, my vision blurring at the edges from lack of oxygen. The realization hit me with the force of physical blow. I wasn't dealing with a haunted object. I was dealing with someone who didn't want me to leave, someone who had been smoking in this house for so long that their presence had soaked into the walls, the floors, the very air itself. Someone who used the turntable as a voice, a way to communicate their desperate need to keep me here. My Uncle Miguel had been a passionate man, known for his love of boleros and his chain-smoking habit. He'd lived alone in this house for 40 years after his wife left him, playing the same sad songs night after night until his death. The neighbors had told me he died sitting in his chair in the living room, a cigarette burning down to his fingers as a bolero played on repeat. Understanding didn't bring relief. It brought a terror so profound my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the ash-covered floor, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe air that felt thick with the weight of decades of loneliness and obsession. He didn't want me to sell the house because he didn't want to be alone again. The turntable wasn't just playing music. It was playing his memories, his emotions, his desperate need for companionship in a form I could hear and smell and feel in every cell of my body. The music started again, but this time I heard it differently. The passion in the singer's voice wasn't about lost love. It was about the fear of being forgotten, of being left behind in an empty house with nothing but echoes and shadows for company. The tobacco smell wasn't just a scent anymore. It was the physical manifestation of my uncle's presence, his way of filling the space between us with something familiar and comforting. I sat on that ash-covered floor for hours, listening to bolero after bolero as the sun set outside and darkness crept through the windows. My body had stopped shaking, my breathing had steadied, but my mind was racing with the implications of what I now knew. I couldn't sell the house because he wouldn't let me, I couldn't remove the turntable because it was his lifeline to the world of the living. I couldn't escape because I was no longer a guest in this house. I was a prisoner, kept here by the desperate love of a dead man who couldn't bear to be alone again. As the last bolero faded into silence, I felt the weight of my future settling onto my shoulders like a heavy coat I could never remove. The turntable's lights dimmed but didn't disappear entirely, maintaining just enough glow to remind me of its presence in the darkness. The tobacco smell softened to a barely perceptible whisper, but I knew it would never fully leave. I remain in the house now, months later, no longer fighting the inevitable. The turntable plays its songs when it chooses, and I've learned to find a strange comfort in the melancholy melodies that fill my days and nights. The tobacco smell has become as familiar as my own breath, and I've stopped trying to understand why my uncle's love manifested as this particular form of imprisonment. Sometimes, late at night when the music swells to fill every corner of the house, I catch myself humming along to songs I've never heard before, but somehow know by heart. In those moments, I wonder if this is how it started for him, if he too was once trapped by someone else's loneliness, someone else's desperate need for companionship. I wonder if someday, I'll be the one playing boleros for the next person who inherits this house, the next soul who will discover that some bonds are too strong for death to break. The needle continues to trace its endless circles, and I continue to listen, bound by invisible threads to a love so powerful it transcends the boundaries between life and death, between freedom and captivity, between the music that plays and the silence that waits to swallow us all. Story 14. The moment I hung that damn cross on the oak tree, I knew I'd made a mistake. The fog rolled in like it had been waiting, coiling around the trunk with unnatural precision, leaving everything else untouched. Standing there in my backyard, watching tendrils of mist caress the weathered bark, I felt my pulse quicken against my throat. The restoration project that had consumed 3 months of my life suddenly felt like a monument to something I didn't understand. I'd found the crucifixo in my late uncle's basement, buried beneath decades of accumulated junk. Carved from what appeared to be ancient wood, it bore intricate symbols I couldn't identify etched along its arms. The craftsmanship drew me in immediately. Every groove, every curve spoke of devotion and skill that belonged to another era. When I discovered woodworms had compromised sections of it, I couldn't bear to let it decay further. My hands worked automatically, stripping away rotted portions, filling gaps with matching wood, sanding until the surface gleamed like honey. But now, hanging from that rope I'd secured to the lowest branch, it looked wrong. The fog clung to it with an intimacy that made my skin crawl, and as afternoon light filtered through the unnatural mist, shadows moved within it that shouldn't exist. I rubbed my eyes, blaming fatigue from the restoration work, but the shadows persisted, writhing like they were alive. The smart thing would have been to take it down immediately. Instead, I retreated to my kitchen window, coffee mug trembling slightly in my grip as I watched the fog thicken. It never spread beyond the tree's immediate vicinity, creating a perfect circle of gray that defied every meteorological principle I knew. My neighbor's yard remained crystal clear, as did the rest of my property. Only that one tree existed in its own private weather system. As evening approached, the fog began to luminescence from within, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed familiar, yet impossible to place. I pressed my face against the window glass, breath fogging the pain as I strained to understand what I was seeing. The pulses were regular, steady, like a heartbeat made visible. My own heart hammered against my ribs in response, and for one terrifying moment, I realized they were synchronizing. Sleep proved impossible that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while every creak and settling sound of the old house seemed amplified. The fog had dissipated with sunset, but knowing it had been there, knowing it would likely return, kept my nervous system on high alert. Around midnight, just as exhaustion began to drag my eyelids down, the first knock came from below. It echoed up through the floorboards, a single sharp rap that made me bolt upright. My mouth went dry as cotton while my heart launched into a frantic rhythm. I held my breath, listening, but silence stretched for what felt like hours. Maybe a pipe had settled, or something had fallen in the basement. Old houses made inexplicable noises all the time. The second knock came 10 minutes later, followed immediately by a third, then a fourth. Each sound reverberated through the house's bones, and as I counted them, something cold crawled up my spine. 4 knocks, exactly matching the rapid pattern my heart had adopted since I'd hung the cross. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling the desperate flutter beneath my ribs, and the knocking below maintained perfect synchronization. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand drawer, hands shaking so badly it took 3 attempts to locate it. The basement stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step sending fresh waves of adrenaline through my system. The narrow beam of light carved through darkness that seemed thicker than it should be, revealing the familiar clutter of stored furniture and forgotten boxes. Nothing appeared disturbed. No fallen objects, no obvious source for the sounds. But standing there in the musty air, surrounded by shadows that my flashlight couldn't fully dispel, I felt watched. The sensation crawled across my skin like insects, raising every hair on my arms and neck. Something in that basement was aware of my presence, studying me with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. The footsteps began as I turned to leave. They started behind me, deliberate and measured, each footfall hitting the concrete floor with wet precision. But when I spun around, light sweeping frantically across the space, nothing was there. The steps continued anyway, moving closer, and I could feel my sanity beginning to fray at the edges. My pulse thundered in my ears now, drowning out rational thought, and those impossible footsteps kept perfect time with its rhythm. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time, slamming the basement door and twisting the lock with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Back in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the mattress, pressing both palms against my chest to feel the wild hammering within. The footsteps had followed me up, I was certain, even though logic insisted such a thing was impossible. They were walking through my house now, matching my heartbeat step for step, and the sound came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. I spent those dark hours sitting by the window, watching the fog return to embrace the tree with the same unnatural affection. In daylight, the whole experience felt like a nightmare my exhausted mind had conjured. But as I stared at the cross hanging innocently in the morning breeze, that fog still wreathing around it like a living thing, I knew my perception of reality had shifted permanently. The second night brought more aggressive manifestations. The knocking started earlier and lasted longer, sometimes coming in rapid bursts that made my heart race until I thought it might burst. The footsteps grew bolder too, moving through rooms above and below me with increasing confidence. I tried wearing headphones, cranking music loud enough to drown out the sounds, but somehow they penetrated anyway, seeming to come from inside my skull rather than my ears. By the third night, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about my own mind. Sleep deprivation was taking its toll, leaving me jumpy and paranoid, jumping at every normal house sound while the supernatural ones had become sickeningly familiar. The cross continued to summon its fog each evening, and I'd begun to see shapes moving within that gray embrace, tall, angular forms that watched me from between the oak's branches. I researched the cross online, diving deep into religious artifact databases and historical records. What I found made my blood freeze. The symbols etched into its surface weren't decorative flourishes as I'd assumed. They were binding marks, used centuries ago to contain malevolent spirits within consecrated objects. My restoration work hadn't simply repaired an antique religious piece. I'd unknowingly released something that had been imprisoned within that wood for God knew how long. The footsteps that night sounded different, heavier, more purposeful. They weren't simply wandering anymore, they were searching. I could hear furniture being moved in rooms I wasn't occupying, drawers sliding open and closed, as if something was systematically examining my belongings. My heart maintained its frantic pace, and those sounds continued to mirror it exactly, creating a rhythm that felt like mockery. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I sat paralyzed on my bed, barely breathing, as the doorknob slowly turned. The door remained closed. I'd locked it hours ago, But the knob continued its rotation, metal grinding against metal with deliberate malice. My pulse hammered so hard I could see it jumping in my wrists. And somewhere in the house, other footsteps echoed that same desperate rhythm. The door never opened, but I knew with absolute certainty that something stood on the other side, waiting. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against my chest, making each breath a struggle. Hours passed with me frozen in that position, too terrified to move, too exhausted to maintain the paranoia. When morning finally came, I found deep scratches in the wood around the door's lock, as if something had tried to claw its way through. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching exorcism rituals and binding spells. Most of what I found seemed like superstitious nonsense, but desperation made me willing to try anything. The local priest I contacted listened to my story with polite skepticism, before suggesting I might benefit from speaking with a counselor about stress and sleep disorders. His dismissal only deepened my isolation. That evening, as the fog began its nightly gathering around the oak tree, I made my decision. I couldn't live with this presence in my house, couldn't endure another night of synchronized terror. Armed with a ladder and bolt cutters, I approached the tree with grim determination. The fog parted around me as I walked, creating a path but never fully dissipating, and I could feel things moving just beyond my peripheral vision. The cross hung higher than I'd remembered, and reaching it required stretching to my full height on the ladder's top rung. As my fingers closed around the wood, a shock of cold shot through my entire body, and for one horrifying moment, I felt something else's memories flooding my mind. Images of dark rituals, of terrified faces, of binding ceremonies performed by desperate people trying to contain something unspeakable. The fog exploded outward as I cut the rope, rushing past me like a living thing seeking escape. I tumbled from the ladder, cross clutched against my chest, feeling its unnatural chill seeping through my shirt. Behind me, the footsteps had begun again, but now they were running, chasing me across the yard as I stumbled toward my house. I made it inside and slammed the door just as something heavy struck it from the outside. The entire frame shuddered with the impact, and I pressed my back against the wood, breathing in ragged gasps. The cross in my hands had grown warm now, almost hot, and I could see light seeping from between its wooden fibers. The pounding on my door continued throughout the night, sometimes rhythmic like heartbeats, sometimes frantic like panic. But gradually, as dawn approached, the sounds began to fade. The cross in my lap had burned itself out, leaving only charred wood and the faint scent of sulfur. I never hung anything on that oak tree again. The fog never returned, and the footsteps that had haunted my house fell silent. But sometimes in the deepest part of night, I still feel something watching me from beyond my windows, patient and hungry, waiting for another opportunity to synchronize its existence with the frightened rhythm of my heart. And sometimes, when I'm not careful about my thoughts, I find myself wondering what other restored artifacts might be hanging in other yards, summoning their own private weather, harboring their own imprisoned horrors. The cross sits in my basement now, reduced to ash and memory, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that destroying it didn't banish what I'd released. It only forced it to find other ways to make itself known. The scratches on my bedroom door remain, even after multiple attempts to sand them away, and my sleep still carries the echo of synchronized footsteps that mirror the guilty racing of my heart. Story 15. Some nights, the darkness outside those glass doors doesn't just hide what's beyond. It reveals what shouldn't be there at all. The security desk sat positioned like a watchtower in the center of the warehouse lobby, its cheap fluorescent fixture casting harsh shadows that danced with every flicker of the dying bulb overhead. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, the parking lot stretched into blackness, interrupted only by the weak yellow glow of a single streetlight that had been strobing intermittently for the past 3 weeks. Beyond that, nothing but the kind of winter darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. My breath fogged slightly in the air. The building's heating system had been cutting out sporadically since the temperature dropped to -5 degrees Celsius outside. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, but I kept taking sips anyway, more for the routine than the caffeine. The liquid tasted bitter and metallic, leaving an unpleasant coating on my tongue. I'd been working night security at the Meridian Industrial Complex for 8 months, and the job had settled into a rhythm of mundane predictability. Walk the perimeter every 2 hours, check the loading docks, scan my badge at each checkpoint, return to the desk, repeat. The pay wasn't much, but it covered rent and groceries, and most nights passed without incident. Most nights I could almost convince myself that the occasional creaking sounds were just the building settling, that the shadows moving in my peripheral vision were tricks of tired eyes. Tonight felt different from the moment I'd clocked in at 11 p.m. The sensation started as a subtle awareness, like the feeling of being watched that raises the hair on your neck before your conscious mind registers why. I found myself checking the monitors more frequently, scanning the grainy black and white feeds from the exterior cameras with growing unease. The feeds showed the same empty views they always did: vacant loading bays, deserted walkways, rows of parked cars covered in frost. Around 1:30 a.m., during my first perimeter check, I'd noticed something odd about the main entrance. The glass doors, usually pristine and reflecting the interior lighting clearly, bore what looked like a handprint pressed against the outside surface. Not unusual in itself. Maintenance workers, delivery drivers, even other security guards sometimes touched the glass. But this print was different. It was too large, the fingers too long, and it seemed to have been made from the inside surface of the glass, as if someone had reached through from within the building itself. I'd cleaned it off with glass cleaner from the supply closet, telling myself it was probably just condensation that had formed in an unusual pattern. But my hands trembled slightly as I worked, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, convinced I could feel eyes boring into my back. By 3 a.m., the unease had settled into my bones like the cold. Every small sound seemed amplified in the silence: the hum of the vending machines, the distant rumble of the heating system cycling on and off, the barely audible buzz of the fluorescent lights. I started keeping the flashlight within easy reach on the desk, though I couldn't articulate why I might need it inside a well-lit building. The first real sign that something was wrong came during my second perimeter check at 3:15. As I approached the main entrance from inside the lobby, movement outside caught my eye. Through the glass doors, a figure stood motionless in the parking lot, perhaps 20 feet from the entrance. The figure appeared to be facing the building, though the distance and poor lighting made details impossible to discern. I stopped walking, my heart rate immediately spiking as adrenaline flooded my system. Security protocol dictated that I should radio the incident to the monitoring service, but something about the figure's absolute stillness kept me frozen in place. It wasn't moving at all, not shifting weight from foot to foot, not the small unconscious movements that characterize living beings. It simply stood there, a dark silhouette against the barely lighter darkness of the night. I fumbled for the flashlight on my belt, my fingers clumsy with sudden nervousness. The beam cut through the glass and illuminated the parking lot in a harsh white circle. But when the light reached the spot where the figure had been standing, nothing was there. Just empty asphalt glistening with frost and the faint impressions of tire tracks from the day shift. My mouth had gone completely dry, and I realized I was breathing in short, shallow gasps that fogged the air in front of my face. I swept the flashlight beam across the entire visible area of the parking lot, but found no trace of what I'd seen. The rational part of my mind suggested it had been a shadow cast by the malfunctioning streetlight, or perhaps a trick of tired eyes interpreting the darkness incorrectly. But my body knew better. Every muscle remained tense, coiled with the primitive awareness that something was hunting. I completed the rest of the perimeter check mechanically, moving through the motions while my attention remained focused on the entrance. Back at the security desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that returning to that glass wall was a mistake. The position that had felt safe and commanding earlier now felt exposed, vulnerable. Anyone, or anything, outside could see me clearly while remaining hidden in the darkness, beyond the reach of the interior lighting. At 4:10 a.m. it returned. This time I saw it approaching from the parking lot, moving with an unnatural gliding motion that seemed to ignore the rough texture of the asphalt. As it drew closer, details became visible that sent ice water through my veins. The figure appeared human in shape, but wrong in proportion. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its frame. It wore what looked like clothing, but the garments hung strangely, as if they didn't quite fit the body beneath. But it was the face that locked my breathing in my throat. Even at a distance, I could see that it was perfectly smooth, like polished porcelain or plastic. No features were visible, no eyes, nose, or mouth, just an unbroken surface that reflected the weak streetlight with an oily sheen. It was the face of a mannequin, but animated with purpose and intelligence that no artificial construction should possess. The thing approached the glass doors with deliberate intent, stopping just outside the entrance. It stood there for several seconds, that blank face turned toward me, and I felt certain it was studying me despite having no visible eyes. Then, slowly, it began to move closer to the glass. My hand found the flashlight without conscious thought, and I clicked it on, sending the beam through the glass to illuminate the figure. Immediately, it stopped moving and began to retreat, stepping backward with the same unnatural gliding motion. As the light hit its face directly, I could see that the surface wasn't just smooth. It was completely featureless, like a void shaped into human form. I kept the light trained on it as it moved away, and it continued retreating until it reached the edge of the illuminated area. There it stopped, just outside the flashlight's reach, and remained motionless again. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel the pulse in my neck and temples. Sweat had broken out across my forehead despite the cold, and my hands were shaking badly enough that the flashlight beam wavered noticeably. I tried to convince myself to move, to call for backup, to do something other than stand there frozen like prey, but my body refused to respond to conscious commands. Minutes passed, 5, 10, maybe more, with both of us locked in this bizarre standoff. The thing remained perfectly still at the edge of the light while I stood paralyzed behind the glass, afraid to move, afraid to look away, afraid to turn off the flashlight. The silence was absolute except for my own ragged breathing and the thunderous sound of blood rushing in my ears. Then I noticed something that made my stomach clench with primal terror. Despite the temperature being well below freezing, no breath mist was visible around the figure. In air this cold, even the slightest exhalation should have created visible vapor, but the space around its head remained clear. Whatever was standing outside wasn't breathing. When I finally worked up the courage to blink, a long, deliberate closure of my eyes, the figure was gone when I opened them again. The parking lot stood empty, nothing but frost and shadows under the strobing streetlight. I spent the remaining hours of my shift with every light in the lobby blazing and the flashlight clutched in my sweating palm. Each time I attempted to write up an incident report, the words seemed inadequate, almost ridiculous. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding delusional? How could I describe the complete absence of human warmth from something that looked almost human? When the day shift supervisor arrived at 7 a.m., I found myself telling her about checking unusual activity in the parking lot, mentioning nothing about the figure or its impossible face. She nodded absently while sorting through paperwork and suggested I might have seen someone from the construction crew working on the streetlight repairs. But as I drove home through the gray winter dawn, I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror, couldn't shake the feeling that something smooth and featureless was watching me from behind every shadow. The rational explanation felt like a thin comfort, a bandage over a wound that went much deeper than logic could reach. I called in sick for the next 3 nights, telling myself I needed time to process what had happened, to convince my mind that it had been nothing more than exhaustion and imagination. But when I finally returned to work, drawn back by financial necessity and stubborn pride, I knew with absolute certainty that it would be waiting for me. And I was right. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Every few nights, always between 3 and 4 a.m., the figure would appear in the parking lot. It would approach the glass doors with that same unnatural movement, stop just outside, and remain motionless until I turned the flashlight on it. Then it would retreat to the edge of the light and wait, never breathing, never moving, just watching with that terrible blank face. I started bringing a camera to work, but every photograph came out blurred or empty, showing nothing but shadows and streetlight glare. The security cameras, when I checked them during these encounters, showed only my own figure standing behind the glass, flashlight beam cutting through empty air. The worst part wasn't the appearances themselves. It was the growing certainty that each encounter was part of something larger, a test or evaluation of some kind. The thing was learning my patterns, studying my reactions, and I had no idea what conclusion it was reaching. On the night everything changed, I arrived at work to find a new handprint on the glass doors. This one was larger than before, and positioned at a height that would have required someone over 7 feet tall to make. But what sent cold fear racing through my system was the realization that this print had been made from inside the building. Someone, or something, had been inside the lobby, pressing against the glass from within, looking out at the parking lot while I was away. I spent that shift checking and rechecking every lock, every entry point, every corner where something might hide. But the building was secure, all access points undisturbed, all cameras showing normal activity. Whatever had made that print had left no other trace of its presence. At 3:27 a.m., I saw it approaching through the parking lot again, but this time something was different. As it drew closer, I realized it was carrying something, a small object clutched in one impossibly long hand. When it reached its usual position outside the doors, it held the object up toward the glass. It was a photograph. Even at this distance, even through the glass and poor lighting, I could make out enough detail to recognize what the image showed. Myself, standing behind the security desk, flashlight in hand, taken from outside the building during one of our previous encounters. The thing stood there holding the photograph toward me for several minutes, that blank face turned in my direction, and I understood with horrible clarity that this was a message. It could document me as easily as I was trying to document it. It had been studying me far more thoroughly than I had been studying it. When I raised the flashlight, it retreated as always, but this time it left the photograph pressed against the outside of the glass door. I didn't retrieve the photograph until dawn, when the day shift arrived and normal reality seemed to reassert itself. The image was real enough, clear, well-focused, showing me in perfect detail. But the angle was wrong. To take this shot, the photographer would have had to be standing 15 feet above the ground, hovering in empty air outside the building. I keep the photograph in my wallet now, 3 months later, at a different job in a different city. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and study my own face in the image. The fear, the confusion, the growing awareness that I was part of something beyond my understanding. I never saw the figure again after that final night, but I know it's still out there, still watching, still learning. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of smooth, featureless faces in crowds, in reflections, in the shadows between streetlights. The face at the glass taught me that some encounters aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be survived. And sometimes survival means accepting that you'll never know whether you were the hunter or the prey, whether you escaped or were simply allowed to leave. But you carry the knowledge with you forever. Somewhere in the darkness, something is watching, learning, waiting, and it knows exactly where to find you. History 16. The silence in this building has weight. It presses against my eardrums like deep water, broken only by the distant hum of fluorescent lights that flicker in the hallway outside my door. 3 years I've lived here, surrounded by empty apartments with their doors sealed shut, their windows dark as dead eyes. The landlord assured me the other units would fill eventually, but eventually never came. Now I suspect it never will. I chose this place for the quiet, an escape from the chaos of downtown, from the honking cars and screaming sirens that had driven me to the edge of madness after my breakdown. Dr. Martinez had recommended isolation, time to rebuild my shattered nerves. What he hadn't warned me about was how silence could become its own kind of torture, how it could make you hypersensitive to every creak, every whisper of wind through empty spaces. The first night I heard them, the metallic sounds from above, I convinced myself it was settling. Old buildings do that. Pipes expand and contract, joints shift, metal groans against metal. But buildings don't follow schedules. Buildings don't wait until exactly 2:13 a.m. to start their mechanical symphony. I remember checking my watch that first time, the green glow of the digits burning into my retinas in the absolute darkness of my bedroom. 2:13 a.m. The sound came like a hammer striking an anvil somewhere directly overhead. 3 sharp impacts that seemed to vibrate through the entire structure. Then silence again, as if the building itself was holding its breath. My heart had hammered against my ribs as I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting for the sound to repeat. It didn't. Not that night. But it came back the next night. Same time, same rhythm. 3 metallic strikes that seemed to originate from the apartment directly above mine. 4B, according to the building directory. I'd tried knocking on that door once, early in my tenancy, hoping to introduce myself to a neighbor. No answer. The doormat was clean, untouched by footprints. The newspaper that had been lying outside was yellowed and brittle with age. Tonight marks the 14th consecutive night of the sounds, and my nerves are fraying like old rope. Sleep has become a foreign concept. I lie awake each night, checking my watch obsessively, watching the minutes crawl toward 2:13. My hands shake now, a constant tremor that makes simple tasks like holding a coffee cup an exercise in concentration. The bags under my eyes have deepened into bruised crescents, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror looks like something that should be buried. I've tried everything to rationalize the sounds. Water hammer in the pipes. But I called the super, and he swore the water was shut off to all the empty units. Thermal expansion. But the building's heating system was converted to individual units years ago, and 4B hasn't had power since before I moved in. I even researched the building's history at the local library, searching for any incidents that might explain the phenomenon. Nothing. The building was constructed in 1987. No deaths, no accidents, no reason for anything supernatural to take root in its concrete bones. Yet here I am at 2:10 a.m., 3 minutes from the nightly percussion, standing in my living room wearing nothing but boxer shorts and a cold sweat that makes my skin feel clammy and wrong. My bare feet stick to the hardwood floor, and I can feel my pulse throbbing in my neck like a second heartbeat. The apartment around me feels smaller than usual, the walls pressing inward as if the building itself is contracting around me. 2:11 a.m., I crane my neck upward, staring at the ceiling as if I could see through the layers of drywall and insulation to whatever waits above. The paint up there is perfect, unmarked by water stains or cracks. Everything about this place is pristine, sterile, dead. 2:12 a.m. My breathing becomes shallow, rapid. Each inhale feels insufficient, as if the air itself has thinned. I press my palm against my chest, feeling the frantic rhythm of my heart, and wonder if this is what a heart attack feels like. The thought sends a fresh wave of panic through me, and I have to lean against the wall for support. 2:13 a.m. Clang. The sound crashes through the silence like a physical blow. It's not muffled by distance or intervening floors. It sounds as if someone is striking metal with tremendous force just inches above my head. The vibration travels down through the building's frame, and I can feel it in my bones, in my teeth. Clang. The second strike makes me flinch involuntarily. My hands fly up to cover my ears, but the sound seems to bypass them entirely, resonating directly in my skull. The floorboards beneath my feet actually vibrate, sending tremors up through my legs. Clang. The third and final strike holds a note, a metallic ringing that seems to go on forever. But it's not fading naturally. It's being sustained, amplified, as if the very structure of the building has become a tuning fork. Then silence returns, heavy and oppressive, but somehow different now. The air feels charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. I stand there for several minutes, my chest heaving, waiting for my heartbeat to slow, but it doesn't. If anything, it accelerates. Because tonight, for the first time, the ringing doesn't stop. It's faint now, barely perceptible, but it's there. A thin metallic whisper that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. I press my ear against different surfaces, trying to locate the source, The sound is strongest near the stairwell door. My mouth has gone desert dry, and when I swallow, it feels like sandpaper scraping against my throat. Every instinct screams at me to ignore this, to go back to bed, to pretend nothing has changed. But 14 nights of mystery have carved a hollow space in my sanity, and I need answers more than I need safety. I open the stairwell door with trembling hands. The sound immediately grows stronger, a metallic humming that seems to rise from below and descend from above simultaneously. The stairwell is a concrete shaft lined with iron railings, and every surface seems to vibrate with that thin, persistent note. I grip the handrail, and the vibration travels up my arm like an electric current. The building has 5 floors, and I live on the 3rd. I've never been to the 5th floor. Never had reason to. But now, with the metallic whisper calling to me from above, I begin to climb. Each step on the concrete stairs echoes differently than usual, as if the sound is being absorbed by something that wasn't there before. The fluorescent lights flicker more frequently as I ascend, casting stuttering shadows that make my own silhouette dance on the walls like something possessed. 4th floor. The hallway here is identical to mine. Same beige carpet, same numbered doors, same sense of abandonment. But the metallic humming is stronger now, and I can feel it in the iron railing that runs along the stairwell. It pulses with a rhythm that almost matches my heartbeat, as if the building itself has developed a cardiovascular system. 5th floor. I reach the top of the stairs and stop, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. The hallway should continue here, leading to apartments 5A and 5B. Instead, there's a wall. Not a door that's been sealed, an actual wall made of the same concrete as the stairwell, seamless and solid. It looks like it's been there since the building was constructed, but that's impossible. I've seen the building directory. I've counted the floors from outside. There should be apartments here, but the metallic humming is strongest here, seeming to emanate from the concrete itself. I press my palms against the wall, and the vibration is so intense it makes my bones ache. The sound isn't coming from behind the wall, it's coming from inside it, as if something metallic has been entombed within the concrete. I lean my ear against the surface, and what I hear makes my knees buckle. It's not random metallic noise, it's a pattern. 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause. But underneath that, almost inaudible, there's something else. A tapping, deliberate, measured, Morse code. The realization hits me like a physical blow, and I stumble backward, my hands shaking so violently I can barely maintain my grip on the iron railing. The vibration in the metal is stronger now, pulsing up through my arms and into my chest, making my ribs feel like they're resonating like violin strings. I know Morse code, learned it as a Boy Scout decades ago, back when my mind was stable and the world made sense. The tapping behind the wall is slow but distinct, repeating the same message over and over. H-E-L-P-M-E, H-E-L-P-M-E, H-E-L-P-M-E. My vision blurs, and I have to grip the railing tighter to keep from falling down the stairs. The metallic vibration travels through the iron directly into my nervous system, and I can feel it spreading through my body like some kind of infection. My teeth ache. My spine feels like it's being tuned to the same frequency as whatever is trapped behind that wall. The tapping stops. The sudden silence is more terrifying than the sound ever was. I stand there in the flickering fluorescent light, my chest heaving, my entire body trembling with residual vibration, waiting for the message to resume. But instead, I hear something that makes my blood freeze entirely. Footsteps. Not from behind the wall, from inside the stairwell. Below me. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing toward where I stand. But that's impossible. I would have heard anyone entering the building. The front door creaks like a haunted house prop, and the stairwell echoes every sound. Unless they were already inside. Unless they've been here all along, waiting in one of those empty apartments for someone to finally investigate the sounds. I peer over the railing, looking down into the concrete shaft that leads to the lower floors. The fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh, stuttering relief, creating a maze of shadows that seem to move independently of their sources. I can't see anyone, but the footsteps continue, growing louder, closer. My rational mind tries to assert itself. It could be the super, doing some late-night maintenance. It could be another tenant I've never met, finally moving into one of the empty units. It could be anything except what my terror-soaked imagination is conjuring. But the footsteps don't sound human. They're too heavy, too deliberate, and they're accompanied by a metallic scraping, as if whoever is climbing is dragging something iron against the concrete walls. I make a decision born of pure panic. Instead of going down to meet whatever is coming up, I press myself against the sealed wall and try to make myself invisible. The concrete is cold against my back, and the vibration from whatever is trapped inside makes my skin crawl, but it's better than facing whatever is climbing toward me. The footsteps reach the 4th floor and pause. In the silence, I can hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, and I'm terrified that the sound will give me away. I clamp my hand over my mouth and nose, trying to muffle even that tiny noise. Then the footsteps resume, climbing toward the 5th floor, toward where I'm hiding. I close my eyes and try to disappear into the wall behind me, but the metallic vibration makes it impossible to fade into the background. The humming has returned, stronger than ever, and now it seems to be calling to whatever is climbing the stairs. The sound resonates through my bones, through my brain, until I can't tell where the building ends, and I begin. The footsteps reach the 5th floor landing. I open my eyes and see nothing. The stairwell is empty, lit by the same flickering fluorescence, showing the same concrete and iron that's been there all along. But I can feel a presence, something standing just beyond my peripheral vision, something that exists in the spaces between the light and shadow. The metallic humming reaches a crescendo, and suddenly I understand. There is no 5th floor. There never was. The building directory was wrong, or I've been misreading it for 3 years. The wall in front of me isn't blocking access to apartments that should exist. It's exactly where the building ends. But something thinks those apartments should be there. Something has been trying to create them, to hammer them into existence with metallic strikes that echo through the building's frame. And now it knows I've been listening. The realization comes with a clarity that cuts through my panic like a blade. I'm not dealing with a ghost or an intruder or a supernatural presence. I'm dealing with something far more terrifying, my own mind, finally completing its breakdown, creating elaborate auditory hallucinations and false memories to fill the void left by isolation and paranoia. But even as I think this, the iron railing under my hand pulses with vibration, real and undeniable. The Morse code tapping starts again behind the wall, spelling out its desperate message: HELPME, HELPME, HELPME. And I realize with growing horror that the message isn't coming from something trapped behind the wall. It's coming from me. I've been the one creating the sounds, the one tapping out messages in my sleep, the one whose fractured psyche has been trying to signal for help in the only way it knows how. The empty building, the isolation, the nightly ritual of checking my watch. It's all been my mind's way of processing its own collapse. But that knowledge doesn't make the experience less real. If anything, it makes it more terrifying. Because if I'm the source of the sounds, if I'm the one trapped behind that wall, then there might be no escape. My own mind has become my prison, and I'm both the prisoner and the guard. I stand there against the concrete wall for what feels like hours, feeling the metallic vibration pulse through my body, listening to my own desperate message for help echoing from inside my skull. The fluorescent lights continue their stuttering dance, casting my shadow in fragments across the empty landing. Eventually, I make my way back down the stairs, but I know nothing has been resolved. Tomorrow night at 2:13 a.m., the sounds will return. I'll check my watch, my heart will race, and some part of me will climb these stairs again, searching for answers that don't exist. Because the real horror isn't that something supernatural haunts this building. The real horror is that I do, and I'm both the ghost and the haunted, trapped in a cycle of my own making, with no way out except to accept that the iron echo I've been hearing all along is the sound of my own sanity, hammering desperately against the walls of my mind, trying to break free.